is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 266. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line for his first official, although not first time on the show, his first official show as co-host, Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, welcome.
Hey, everyone. I'm pretty excited to be here, not only because this is a lot of fun and I like working with Marshall, but because I've got a lot to live up to. We announced last week in Grand Prix Denver, this is what was the plan going forward. And we got a lot of awesome responses, but a lot of also like, the other guys did a great job. You need to do a great job. So
yeah, the pressure's on, although I'm going to be here for you. I got your back. We'll make sure you get through it, but I have no worries at all. And by the way, before we get into anything else, what a great reception we had. That was so cool. And I wanted to take a minute to say thanks to all the listeners for being so awesomely supportive. It was kind of overwhelming after we made the announcement at the GP. It was like my phone just kind of kept going and going and going all the way till like the next day.
Yeah, it was incredible. And honestly, that made me even more excited to kind of join this new community that I haven't really been a part of. I mean, I've been on the show a few times, and I followed like the LRcast subreddit even before I had any idea that I was going to be involved with the show or anything like that. And, there's a ton of like strident fans who really like the show. And it's awesome kind of like getting into that because, I'm pretty involved in Magic, a lot of different aspects of Magic. And this is just like a new thing for me. This is very different. I've never regularly done a podcast, and I'm talking to a bunch of people who I guess I've never really interacted as much with before.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really cool though, because what gets to happen is I get to harness your powers and force them in certain directions. Yes. and that's going to be fun. Now, one thing that I want to talk about before we get into the main topics for the show, of which we actually have two. We're starting off with the bang here with LSV's first show. We're going to be talking about the exclusive Limited Resources preview cards, which we released on Monday, and we're going to go over those and kind of get mine and Luis's thoughts on those cards. And this is crept right up on us. In fact, this is actually a show late, but this is the sunset show for Khans of Tarkir, but I really wanted to get at least a few sunset-y type things in. But before we get into that stuff, for those of you that this is news to, or maybe that don't keep up on the social media aspect and stuff, so Luis is the new co-host. I'm sure that you've gathered that so far, but along with that was a new sponsorship deal with ChannelFireball.com. Now, this was part of the bigger picture deal between Luis and I and Channel Fireball. And what I did to get things out of the way really quick is I made a blog post that answers a bunch of the questions that you might have. I got a bunch of questions on Twitter and on the subreddit, and I thought, well, I'll just put all the answers right here. But the basics of it are, the show's now sponsored by ChannelFireball.com. We're going to be, running an ad or two on the show. As a result of that, also some of the branding on LRcast.com is going to have Channel Fireball on it. And you'll see also though that LRcast.com still exists. Everything about the show that is still there. It wasn't the intention for this deal to be like a takeover or a selling of Limited Resources. They're a sponsor. Just we've had sponsors before. We have a sponsor now, and it's a partnership as well. And I'm really, really excited to work with such a great website that has such great vision and leadership within the Magic community. I know that the goal for the podcast, from my perspective, is to try to get people better at Magic. That's my main thing. If anything that I do along the lines of the show, if it helps people get better, improve, get more involved in the game, that's where I want to be. And Channel Fireball is an absolute pillar of the community along those lines, especially given all the content that CFB's put out over the years.
Yeah, and I mean, the main reason that I guess I approached Marshall about this, and because I did approach you first, was I love working with Marshall. I love working with you. This is it's a ton of fun. We've worked together for coverage. I've been on the show a few times, and also I think that Limited Resources, its philosophy is well in line with that of Channel Fireball. I mean, we have a ton of free content. I don't think that I'm exaggerating when I say that we just have an incredible amount of awesome free content, and I think. Bias aside, because obviously I'm one of the contributors, one of the owners of Channel Fireball. I think we are a good community-focused resource. Everyone at Channel Fireball loves Magic and cares about Magic, and that's a big part of why we're all there doing what we do. And I think Limited Resources lines up with that completely. And as a show sponsor, we're not doing anything out of line. We're not trying to, again, like you said, we're not trying to buy limited resources. LRcast.com is still, the home of limited resources. We're just now putting it on Channel Fireball, and now I'm going to be involved with the show, and we want just a little bit of Channel Fireball branding, and that was about it. Other than that, there's no real differences between the limited resources of now and the limited resources of a couple weeks ago, besides potentially an uptick in incredible humor.
That's what I was going to say too. So yeah, channelfireball.com, you know who they are. And you guys know me. I take very seriously who I recommend and what I recommend on the podcast. You won't hear me recommending a website I don't use, and you won't hear me recommending products or even things like articles or other podcasts that I don't actually listen to myself. I take that very seriously. I want there to be a trust between you, the listener, and me and the co-host on our end. And I'm very happy about the deal with Channel Fireball because they are definitely firmly in the camp of companies that I'm proud to be associated with, and I've used their site for quite a long time, both to buy cards but also to go read the content, watch Luis's draft videos and all that kind of stuff. So I think that this is going to be an exciting partnership, and I'm really, really happy that we're kind of entering the next stage with limited resources. Again, I put up a blog post with any questions you guys might have, but if you have any more, you know where to find us on Twitter or via the email. And we're happy to clear up anything just in case you didn't know. Along those same lines, the Patreon, it's still there. It's still a great way to directly support the show. And it's going strong. I posted a draft video on there just for patrons. Of course, there's a bunch of other cool bonuses. A lot of people have been getting their thank you cards, and the last batch of them will be going out shortly as well. If you haven't received yours, hang in there. Should be with you pretty shortly. Okay. We've got... The
only main difference, actually, before we go on, is for set reviews, I'll be awkwardly injecting the price of every single, as found on channelfireball.com for pre-orders.
You're going to insert like a virtual link into every sentence?
No, I'm just going to inform viewers that you can pick this, wonderful magic card up for only $2.99 at channelfireball.com.
Yeah, you try that. You see how long it lasts.
It's all okay. Right. My concept for jokes often outlasts my, patience for the actual joke themselves.
You have incredible patience. I will give you that. All right. So what we've got here, Luis, is a lot to talk about. We've got a Crack-A-Pack to do, and this is an important one. This is our last Khans of Tarkir Crack-A-Pack, and this is a format that I really, really enjoyed, so I'm sad to see it go. So we got to do that. Then we're going to go over the preview cards, and then we're going to do sunset stuff for Khans. So let's waste no time in getting to the Crack-A-Pack. Now, this one was provided by Hugh. That's all I got. And I should actually do this here. Let me do this real quick. I've got some extra Khans packs thanks to all the kind people that give them to me at GPs, but I'm going to put them in the vault. I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do with the vault, but they're just going to sit there for now. So I want to say thank you to Kyle. He was from Toronto. Trevor from GP Baltimore. Thank you for that. David from GP Baltimore. Dan from the Luckiest T-Shirt podcast. That's a real name. Brent from GP Ottawa. And I've got Brent C. Oh, and this is the first pack he won at an 8-man. He decided that since he felt like LR helped him win the pack, he would give it to us. So I thought that was pretty cool.
And an interesting behind the scenes note is that Marshall just has a pack cracking noise that he plays, and then he generates the pack randomly, from a website. So
yeah, I also have a pack smelling generator too, because I got to get that hit. Sage Eye Harrier.
I mean, I would be pretty disappointed to first pick it, though this is, as everyone is probably sure, kind of realized by now, almost every single morph is at the very least playable, and the bar for morphs is so much lower. Like, what's printed on the face of the card can be a lot worse than another comparable card, as long as you have the morph ability. Yeah,
and I found Sage Eye Harrier to be an interesting one just because it happens to be a warrior with evasion. Yep. There's not that many of those, but it is a bird warrior somehow, and then also the fact that it costs 4 to flip up, puts it a little bit below the normal curve for a morph. I found it serviceable, but like you said, I would be pretty bummed if I first picked it. Oh no, already?
So is this Sidisi's pet or is it Hooting Mandrills?
It's Hooting Mandrills.
And just so we're clear, I can't actually see the pack.
No, he can't.
Many states away from
Luis is in Denver and I'm in Washington, and he just snapped that off. And yeah, it's Hooting Mandrills.
Another card.
Not a warrior.
I wouldn't be excited to first pick, but this one actually in some decks especially is the card you're looking for. I mean, the power level of this card at least is high enough that the right deck wouldn't be too unhappy, like say taking it third or so.
Yeah. Like you said, though, it's just not an exciting first pick. Trumpet Blast.
Despite what Jacob Wilson did at the Pro Tour, you should probably not cast this defensively. And you probably don't want to first pick this one either, just because if you're the deck that wants it, the odds that another deck at the table wants it is pretty low.
You know, I've got a solution to the whole defensive Trumpet Blast coming up in our preview cards. We'll talk about that in a minute. Alabaster Kieran.
Another fine card. Another card
that's
I wouldn't want to first pick, but I don't cut this card from my deck almost ever.
Yeah, if I'm playing white, the Kieran almost always makes the cut. I've just found that 2-3 in this format is a really nice sweet spot, and the fact that it has flying and vigilance means that you can trigger raid, get in there pretty consistently, and it also kind of handily blocks some of the annoying flyers in the set too, like Jeskai Wind Scout. So yeah, I'm actually a fairly big fan of the Kieran. I think it's just really well positioned for the format. This next card I do not. In fact, we're going to talk about this one when we get to the sunset stuff, but it's Molting Snakeskin.
Yeah, your favorite card.
I'm not a big fan of this one.
I mean, this is a playable card, certainly in some decks. It is not a first pickable card under really any circumstances.
Right. And I have seen it in a deck where I'm like, okay, I see what you did there, but I would never be happy. I would be quite bummed in almost all scenarios to have to run a Snakeskin, especially just given the card quality that we get these days. Like in this set, the overall card quality is really, really high, and it's just rare that you need to take any type of risk like a Snakeskin. This next one, I like this guy, Glacial Stalker.
Glacial Stalker is kind of, I mean, this and like War Behemoth are kind of like the poster children for morphs being way better than they look. Because,
yes,
you know, obviously a 6-mana 4/6 isn't good, but this card is, or 4/5 rather.
How about a 4/5? Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I was conflating the two.
Yeah.
It's clearly not, that in and of itself is clearly not great or exciting in any way, but because it has morphs, it's just very good. You just flip it up, it's giant, and you can play it on turn 3 if you need to. So.
Yeah, more on that later too. Glacial Stalker has sort of become my go-to kind of boring morph example, but the reason why I always bring it up is because I think it's better than like a lot of the commons in the set.
It's clearly better than it looks, because it definitely does not look good.
It does not look good. I remember thinking
it is very strong.
Yeah, I remember thinking it was kind of a throwaway when I first saw it. I thought, oh, sure, they're going to give us some kind of middle ground, biggish morphs that are kind of do. But it turns out that even like a Glacial Stalker, you just put that up against so many different cards in the format, and I'll often just would prefer to have a Glacial Stalker. Bitter Revelation.
This is an important card. It's very, very good and sealed, and there are some draft decks that are very happy to have it, but kind of it's not quite as extreme as Trumpet Blast, but it's still one of those cards that like not every black deck is going to want it, which means there's not that many decks at the table that really are fighting you for this card. So first picking it is not a very good sign.
Yeah, that's what I found too with these. With most of the card draw spells, I mean this and Treasure Cruise are two of the premium ones. Where Weave Fate is a lot less premium and Tormenting Voice as well. But Bitter Revelation is really, really powerful if you can resolve it on a board where you're not being immediately threatened. But if you find yourself in the unenviable position of being immediately threatened and needing to tap out for Bitter Revelation, that can really add up quickly. The life loss plus the tempo loss just means that you can get ran over. But every time I've had 2 or 3 blockers down and cast Revelation, I just feel like $1 million.
Yeah, and if you're playing a deck that utilizes the graveyard as a resource, then the card becomes slightly above raid, whereas at its base level, I think it is actually slightly below raid.
Okay, sure. Snowhorn Rider.
The tricolor cycle of morphs is pretty good. It's if you're in the clan, I mean that's one of the reasons to be any particular clan is that you're getting these cards late. This again, it's a 3-color card, which like first pick, first pack, I would rather take Glacial Stalker, but if you know your teamer, then this is clearly a very good card, and it's not the end of the world to have to first pick like this or Obzon Guide or something like that. Yeah.
The next one is Throttle, which is I think a card that early on I was like, and then I realized later, no, you're going to want to run your throttles. I mean, at 5 mana, you can't just run all of them, but I've been able to consistently get 1-for-1s out of Throttle, ever since I kind of started picking it a little bit higher.
Yeah, the removal spells in this format are kind of not great overall.
They're bad, yeah.
They're quite mediocre. But the difference between having 0 removal spells and 2 is incredibly large. You don't just die to a 3/3 flyer, or Anafenza's Herald or something like that. And even if you wouldn't want this as your 4th or 5th removal spell very often, or you certainly don't want like 3 Throttles in your deck, but having the first one is pretty important. So again, still nothing's setting off any bells as far as a first pick here, but Throttle's slightly above average playable.
Right. Our last common is Blossoming Sands. So we did get 1 land out of the mess here before we hit our commons. It's the green-white dual land.
Yeah, I mean, I have first picked these lands often enough that I'm, not super sad if I have to, but it's not really my goal either, especially before knowing which color my cards are. I mean, going into pack 3, there are some decks where you're like, yes, first pick, dual land. Going into pack 1...
When you're in panic mode.
Yeah, going into pack 1, you really shouldn't be there because it's like a gold card. It's like taking a green-white gold card. You don't know if you're green or white.
Right, yeah. There was a stretch during the early to mid part of the format where I was drafting 5-color decks almost every time, and I would be quite happy to take basically any dual land, and especially any tri-land. But these days I've found that there's other people doing that, and it's the risk is a lot higher. So I want my dual lands to actually perform within the confines of not 5-color. And like you said, it just sometimes you just end up not in those colors, and then all of a sudden you've wasted a first pick, not even a later pick.
Well, and worth noting is the allied ones are worse than the enemy ones because they fit into less of the clans.
Right. Uncommons. Here's the good stuff, usually. And this one is, here's Chief of the Edge.
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, Black-White Warriors is one of the better archetypes, and even though taking this is pretty aggressive, like you're leaning towards an aggressive deck, it's still a card that fits into pretty much any of the clans that, share those colors, like Mardu or Abzan, and Black-White is probably actually the best of these straight 2-color combinations. So starting out with that as a gold card is not a bad thing.
Do you prefer Chief of the Edge or Chief of the Scale generally?
Chief of the Scale I think is a lot better. It can brawl into morphs, which is like the biggest part. The funny thing is Chief of the Scale has the better actual stats, though its ability is generally a little bit worse, whereas Chief of the Edge makes your Sage Eye Harriers double their clock, and most importantly makes 1/1 tokens fight as 2/1s, which trades for morphs. But when you're playing a 2-drop, you generally care more that you have a 2/3 than 3/2.
Yeah, that's kind of how I view them too, is just that the Chief of the Scale stands up much better on its own, but Chief of the Edge in the right deck is way more powerful. I mean, yeah, you can get like Take Up Arms or those type of cards, and Chief of the Edge makes that card fantastic, where Chief of the Scale makes it like, well, now they're all 1/2s. It's like not that impressive.
The 2/3 doesn't scale very well to the late game, but is much better on turn 2.
Right. Next one, Become Immense.
It's a fine card, and obviously can end games pretty easily, but it's not really what I want to be first picking. The combat tricks are just not that great in this set, especially since you already have all these built-in combat tricks. You have morphs. You don't need more things to sink your mana into generally.
Right.
Though that being said, this is one of the better ones when you can cast it for 1 mana.
All right. Speaking of one of the better ones, we've got a nice one here. This is one of my favorite uncommons. It's Abzan Falconer.
Yeah, this is a really good one because it's good stats when you first cast it, cheap, single color in one of the better colors to be in or to start with, and a very relevant ability not only when you use it, but also just sometimes you'll just play it and kill them in the same turn later.
Yeah, you see that too. I've done that lots of times, and I can't. It's just it feels like this card is good at every stage. Like when you have it in your hand, you're like, okay, it's fine in my opener. I can play it as a 2/3 for 3, and that's already fine. I've cast Mardu Horde Chief multiple times without raid, and it's like, wow, this thing still pulls its weight okay. And then the Falconer only having to outlast for white means that you can find a place to do that. And once you get it in the air as a 3/4 flyer, you rarely need to put more counters on it. Like it's already usually the biggest thing flying, and you can kind of take over from there. I'm a huge fan of the Falconer.
Yeah, This is the first card I'd legitimately be excited to first pick.
Me too.
I'm actually happy.
Now, This is a really good. I'm glad we're ending on this one. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. So we've actually got a mythic rare, and it's Anafenza the Foremost.
So I actually think that this pick isn't that close.
It's a Falconer, right?
Yeah, it really is.
I think it is too.
I mean, yes, if Anafenza cost white too, if they have the exact same mana cost, I would take Anafenza, but you lose a lot of the power when you don't play your 3 mana 4/4 on turn 3, which you're just not going to do that often.
No, you're just not. And plus the risk that you're taking on by taking a full-on 3-colored gold card on your very first pick. I mean, if we take the Falconer, we can go different directions. We can end up being in Mardu and not even worry about green. But with Onofenza, you know, hey, it might even make our draft worse if we, you know, tend to walk down some path that just isn't there for us, especially given that Abzan is generally speaking the most popular and probably powerful of the clans. So like you're probably going to be fighting people.
Yeah, and even though you clearly play on Onofenza and even an Abzan control deck, she's also just worse there too. If your goal is not to be smashing your opponent with, you know, a good curve, then a 3-mana 4/4 is just not really quite as powerful as it looks. Because it looks like an amazing card, and clearly, you know, how good she is in constructed shows that her rate is very, very good. But yeah, in actually the show notes that we were looking at before the show, I actually had Siege Reno in in the overrated card section, and for this exact reason. You're not really getting the full benefit of its incredible rate because you're just not casting it on curve often enough that you're just going to end up casting on Onofenza on turn 5 or 6, and she's comparable to, you know, our good friend Glacial Stalker at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting when you put it that way. I'm in the same boat though. For my pick for this one is definitely the Falconer.
Yeah, I would certainly take the Falconer unless I knew I was going to, you know, get to add 3 Sandstep Citadels to my deck.
Right. And it's funny because, I mean, in even just heads up, like the Falconer does have tangible benefit over Onofenza, like even if they were both colorless or whatever. You know, the Falconer being able to fly at some point can be a big deal. You know, sometimes Onofenza does get blanked on the ground and you just want to fly her. And also, you know, of course, the ability to block flyers as well.
Yeah, I mean, which one would you rather top deck on turn 10? It's just going to be the Falconer almost for sure.
Totally. That's sweet. That was a good one. And of course, I'll put that one up in the blog as well. I put up all of the Crack-A-Packs on the blog so that you guys can vote on them as well. I put a poll up there, and so you guys can let us know what you would take out of that pack. Okay.
Am I allowed to vote for an option that I said not to do?
Yes. Yeah, it is funny how that works though, right? Because like when I'm doing the show, I'll be like, this is what you should take, right? But then sometimes in my head, I'm like, well, I know I would take that, you know, because like I've been drafting this format, on draft number 40, right? I might be a little bit willing to go in some different directions than I would be like if I was sitting day 2 at a GP or whatever.
Oh yeah, I always definitely hit the most dangerous portion of every format for my Magic Online account is when I just go off the wall and only draft gimmick decks. And that generally happens with any format that I like a lot. And that's when you start seeing, you know, the first pick like secret plans over something like Abzan Falconer. And at that point I know I should probably just, you know, take a little break and wait for the next format.
Yeah, I always hit that at some point. But I will say I agree. It only happens to me on formats that I really enjoy. Like, you know, I remember drafting my third attempt at Delver of Secrets deck in Innistrad, which just never worked ever. And that was after I had exhausted all the other, you know, known options in that format. So, all right, well, why don't we take a look at our preview cards now? This is cool because you need more preview cards in your life, Luis.
Yeah,
you now get point, more.
I'm only getting the preview cards from my column on, you know, Wizards Magic, now limited resources, and for ChannelFireball. So I'm only getting, you know, three batches.
Right, I'm 2/3. I get ones for the column and for the show, but but you get to be part of these ones too. So. They came out on Monday because the way this works, just in case people don't know, is when you get a preview card from Wizards, they tell you the date that it's going to go up. And we were in transit, actually. Well, you weren't because you were actually already at home in Denver, but I was covering the GP in Denver, so I was flying home on Monday. And I figured, well, we'll just talk about them on the show. But Monday was our day, so they went up. And we've actually got 4 preview cards. There's a 5th that was already previewed, but we figured it's part of this cycle, so we may as well talk about it. But and they're really cool. They're all gold, and let's just dive right into them. The first one that we have is something I alluded to a few minutes ago about the defensive trumpet blast. It's called War Flare, and it costs 2 red, but also white. So 2 red, white, 4 mana for an instant, and it's a common. And it says. It's real simple. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Untap those creatures.
Yeah, and so what I think what happened is Wizards heard that Jacob Wilson cast this defensively, And they're like, no, that's no good. Let's send out a Warflare.
So you're saying if you see Jacob Wilson at a GP, don't have him sign your Warflare? Is that?
Oh no, definitely do. He loves it. I mean, the thing about Jacob, I mean, this is a short aside, is that he's got a great sense of humor and is very self-effacing. So he certainly does not mind poking fun at himself.
No, yeah,
which I actually do like in a person because I like poking fun at them.
You know.
No. But yeah, getting back to the card, as you alluded, it is a defensive card as well as an offensive card, and that's what kind of makes it so interesting. Whereas Trumpet Blast goes in very specific decks, which is decks that can make a lot of creatures and want to attack every turn. You can play Warfare pretty well in almost any just mid-range deck if, assuming you're going to have access to these colors fairly easily.
Yeah, a couple of things to note about the card. Well, the first one is that it's not +2/+0. It's +2/+1. And I think that's fairly easy to overlook, that +1 on the toughness. But it is always shocking how much that actually matters when you go into combat. Getting +1 on toughness on your creatures is a big deal, and it really, really can make life difficult for your opponent. And that also includes, of course, on defense. And the really cool part about Warflare is that not only can you use it defensively, as like you could with a few other instant speed mass pump spells, but it also untaps your creatures. So you're going to get all of them. One thing that occurs to me right away is that if you happen to have creatures with first strike, even just one or two of them, I mean, this thing, if you're going to play it, untap your creatures and block, like you could have some great blocks with this.
Yeah, certainly. And this is a card that's really hard to play around. I mean, let's say an average scenario is your opponent has like two creatures and you have two creatures. You attack with both and they're like, aha, you've got a Warflare. I'm not going to block. You're like, all right, take 9.
Right.
My creatures are now untapped. Yeah. I can block you. Or you don't cast the Warflare. You just, all right, take 4, take 5. And then they're like, oh, wait, I can't attack because of Warflare. And then they say go, and you get to just unmorph one of your creatures or do use your mana for some good effect.
Right.
It's just a really versatile card because of that. And like you said, the toughness means that your 2/2s beat their 2/2s, your 3/3s beat their 3/3s, etc.
Now, let's talk about realities here, though, right? On one hand, well, it's obvious, but you need creatures to make Warflare work. How happy are you if you've got a creature and a Warflare? I mean, it's not the worst, but that's probably not ideal.
It's a little expensive, so like, yeah, you when you play your Morph on turn 3, they play Morph. You play a 4th land and attack. If I think my opponent has Warflare in that spot, I'm just going to block.
Yeah.
They spent their 4th turn to kill my Morph, good for them.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think you're happy with is if you can trade Warflare for a creature and get 2 extra damage in, and then have now 2 blockers so you can't get attacked back, that you're talking about a 1-for-1 that did 2 damage to them and maybe prevented 2 to 4 damage. That's a fun card.
That's a pretty big swing, yeah.
And that's I think near the bottom edge of the cases. I mean, that's fairly easy to attain. With obviously the high end, this card doesn't actually have a cap, right? This card can deal 10 damage. It can trade for 5 creatures. It can fog, 7 of their creatures. It can do all those things. So I think when you look at this card or any card like this, you have to look at all the different stages and realize that it's not that hard to get a good use case out of it, and the high end is just so high.
Right. And of course, talking about maximizing this card, tokens, right? I mean, we're looking at Ponyback Brigades. We're looking at anything that just spits out multiple bodies from one card. Warflare is going to be great with. I mean, we've seen this, right? We've seen this with the Rush of Battle and the Trumpet Blast deck that we've already got. And remember, for Fate Reforged, we are talking about 1 pack of Fate Reforged and 2 of Khans of Tarkir. So those cards are still going to be around, and the token makers that enable that strategy are still going to be in 2 out of the 3 packs that you draft in this format. So Warflare goes right into those decks as well, and it's much better. I mean, I would, like, if I could pay the white, I would put Warflares in over Trumpet Blasts all day. Like, the difference between 3 and 4 mana isn't that big in this scenario because it's so rare that you're, even turn 3 or turn 4 into Trumpet Blast. It's more like a turn 7 or turn 8 play anyway. So if you can have the colored mana available, Warflare just seems like a no-brainer over it.
Yeah, this card's much more interesting to me than Rush of Battle or Trumpet Blast because the decks where those go in are pretty linear, and they're like you look at a deck and you can pretty much tell if it wants Trumpet Blast or Rush of Battle, whereas Warflare goes in a much wider range of decks, not only means you get to play with it more, you don't have to draft a specific deck to make it good. It means you're going to play against it more too, which, it's a cool card. Like, there's a lot of counterplay in the card, even though the later the game goes, the more difficult it is to avoid this card being insane.
Yeah. One other thing before we move on to our next one is that this is a common. I mean, you're going to see these. Like, even if they're only in one pack, they are going to be around. This is a card that you can't ignore. It reads like an uncommon. I think if you read me this card, I would say it's probably an uncommon. If you told me it was a common, I might not be shocked, but I'm like, oh, okay. Like that, my eyebrows are up. I'm like, wow, I got to think about Warflare a lot more often, than I'd maybe think. All right, this next one. This one's pretty sweet. It's called Harsh Sustenance, and it costs 1 white-black for an instant. And it says it deals X damage to target creature or player, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control.
Yeah, so this is another card that's good in tokens. It's also, they're both part of like the Mardu, clan with black, white, and white, red there. But it's also another card like Warflare that's powerful enough and needs few enough creatures to be decent that I think you're going to see a decent amount of play of this. This card's going to show up in most decks that can cast it easily. Yeah,
I think so too. I mean, what's the number? Like, how would you feel if you had 2 creatures? So you're casting a 3 mana instant speed drain. What's it called? Like a Thorin's Thirst or whatever. Yeah. Lightning Helix for 2, right? Because you can dome them.
Right. So 2 is again the minimum case for this. If this card lost all its text or rather, if X was just locked for 2, if this just was 1 white black deal 2 gain 2, it'd be a fine card. You would play it almost every time. And the fact that it's not that hard to get it to 2 and it's not that hard to get it to like 5 makes it a very strong card.
Yeah, this card does seem quite good to me. I mean, the downside is real. Sometimes you have those draws where you just don't have any creatures. Sometimes they kill your creatures in response.
Yeah, that's the real blowout.
Yeah, that can be really bad. You have to be super careful about how you use this thing. But the card, I mean, we don't get 3 mana instant speed removal really at all anymore. And this has the capability to do that. And also it gives you a really interesting game plan if you get stalled out. If you're just like, well, we've each got 5 creatures and we're just top decking, here's another creature, sure, I'll play it, go. And you're just kind of, waiting for something to happen. And then bang, you draw Harsh Sustenance, and now you can dome them if they're in range. You can try to get an attack in where you just get them down to lethal. And harsh, and this is tricky, and we'll probably talk about more of this stuff during the set review next week. But you could find yourself in a situation where you attack with all of your creatures, let them make blocks after blocks, Harsh Sustenance you before damage. That way you get the maximum amount of sustenance, and then hopefully the creatures that weren't blocked will finish off your opponent. But there's some sequencing there that you got to make sure you get right before you just start firing this thing off.
Yeah, and I think just the existence of this card means if your opponent's these colors and just stops attacking even when they have like plausible attacks, you have to start thinking about this. You're like, oh, I'm at 7, they have 4 creatures out. Maybe I should force some trades, even unfavorable trades, just because you don't want to just, get Harsh Sustenance kill you from 7 life, which it can do very easily.
It really can, yeah. And again, tokens, yeah. This next one is sweet. It's called Grim Contest. And it's 1 black green for an instant. Also at common, it says choose target creature you control and target creature an opponent controls. Each of those creatures deals damage equal to its toughness to the other.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, this card is interesting and it is powerful, but this feels like it's a step behind the other cards in terms of how impactful this is. Like, yeah, it's interesting and new that you have creatures, fighting with their toughness instead.
The card's weird, right? Like, but I read it when they sent it to us. I'm like, what does this do? And it's like this, like my walls are now like crashing down on my opponent's creatures or something. It's very strange.
Yeah, and even though it does, make like Archer's Parapet, for example, like you mentioned on your blog post, fight and kill their 4/4s, with impunity. Ultimately, this is just a fight card, and that's way less swingy than Harsh Sustenance or Warflare. So
yeah,
I mean the card is fine, and you will have to like look at your creatures to try to figure out if it's going to be good. But most fight cards have always been fine, especially instant speed ones. Like if they go to kill your creature and you just have this in response, you're fine if the 2 creatures trade, for example. But it is funny that this does feel like, in terms of its global impact, it's a step behind the other cards we have seen, and actually the other cards we will see, because I was able to scroll down and actually look at the other cards.
Sure, yeah, and I think that that's really important. What you said, to summarize that, is that it is just a fight card. The things to keep in mind, I think, are that it costs a full 3 mana of 2 different colors, so you're not always going to be able to cast it right when you want, and leaving that kind of mana up is, carries a very big cost. And B, it is an instant, so. I think if you get the opening to take out something reasonable and you've got the mana up, you probably just go for it. I mean, again, if you're the one who initiates this fight between the two creatures and your creature gets killed, you just got blown out. If you get to do it in response or during combat, or, find a way to make it work where your opponent doesn't have the mana to punish you for it, you're going to be happy. But this isn't just one of those unconditional removal spells. You need you also need to have a creature with higher toughness than your opponents. I mean, you need something, big on the ground, and that won't always happen either. So I think that Grim Contest is going to see play, and I think that when it goes off, it's going to be good. But I also think that prudent players will note that it's pretty darn conditional, and there is a fairly high risk. On the show we call it setup cost, and I think the setup cost for Grim Contest is pretty high. It's not prohibitively high, but it is high enough where you're not just like, oh sweet, a new removal spell next. It's like, it's a card you need to kind of work with.
And a card like Prey Upon from Innistrad, is like 1 green, 2 creatures fight.
Yeah,
that was good because it was so efficient. You could play a 2/3 and fight their guy on turn 4, whereas Grim Contest, it costs 3 mana, 2 different colors. It's a card I think you're going to play more often than you don't play, but it's not an auto-include, whereas some of these preview cards that we've seen are pretty close to that. Like Harsh Sustenance, I think, as long as you have 14 or more creatures, it's going to be hard to cut that from your deck.
Right. This next one's interesting. I want to hear what you have to say about it. I kind of wavered as I was reading it. I'm kind of like, oh, this is sweet. And I'm like, well, maybe it's okay. And then I kind of ended up somewhere in the middle. It's called Cunning Strike, and it costs 3 blue-red for an instant. So we're talking about a 5 mana instant here. As in most formats, and especially this one, the one that we're entering with 2 cons, is 5's a crowded slot. You're going to have great things to do at 5 mana, and Cunning Strike is going to be competing for those things. So this is what it does, though. It does a lot. So at instant speed, it does 2 damage to a creature, it does 2 damage to a player, and you get to draw a card.
Well, I like the last line.
It's a lot of action. Yeah. So when I first read it, I thought, well, how could this be anything but great? It's replacing itself and it's doing all these different things. But then when I was writing out the text on the blog post, I'm like, well, you know what? Now, wait a minute. It's 5 mana. So it's not like we're like killing their morph on turn 3 here, right? It's going to be a little while later. So we're going to kill something probably. But at this stage of the game, that something is going to be somewhere in the 2 or 3 mana range, which might or might not be great. But it's probably not our biggest threat. Like if our opponent goes, play any 5 mana creature, go, and our plan is to go land Cunning Strike, our Cunning Strike's probably not killing their 5 mana creature. It's probably killing something they played earlier, which is fine. That's not bad at all. It's just maybe not solving the problem that we want to solve. The 2 damage to a player it's funny because I always think about the 2 damage to a player as being underrated, because it's like, it looks like it's tacked on. It's like, yeah, you hit him for 2, whatever. But every time I play a card that says do 2 damage to a player, ping the player, do 3 damage to a player, I'm always like, that's always better than it looks. But it also isn't great, right? Like I do have to keep in mind that doing 2 damage to a player is a nice bonus, but it is not, one of the reasons to play this card. They have 20 life. Like you're not doing enough to say, well, I'm going to finish the game with my Cunning Strike very often. And then the draw card is, like you said, is probably the best part of the whole thing. Like you're getting all this for just a tempo loss. And you're still getting quite a bit. Well, what do you make of this card, Luis?
Yeah, I actually echo a lot of your statements here. It is not going to kill any card that's like close to it in terms of mana cost. Like, for example, if you have 5 mana up for this and your opponent has 5 mana up to unmorph a morph, there's no morphs that this still kills unless you're talking about like a Canyon Lurkers or something.
Right.
On the end, the 5-drop slot is pretty crowded. On the other hand, I can forgive a lot for draw a card.
Yeah, me too. No kidding.
I mean, I'm not even joking. When a card doesn't cost you an actual card, that reduces the burden a lot, because at that point you're just talking about time, and yeah, you can't play like 5 Cunning Strikes in your deck, but I would be loath not to include 1 or 2 Cunning Strikes in a deck that could easily generate red and blue mana just because it's so free, and there's so many cards that trigger off you playing instants. And even though it does cost 5 mana and that competes with other cards you have, when you leave up, the mana to unmorph Glacial Stalker and you leave up Cunning Strike at the same time, that is actual value, because sometimes your opponent makes a play where Cunning Strike becomes better than unmorphing, and having the option to do either is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and like compare this to Master of the Way.
Master of the Way is a lot better, because Master of the Way can just kill your opponent, is one of the things it does. It can also kill their 5/5s on turn 5 or 6 pretty easily.
And draw you that card.
Yeah, and they both draw you the card. That being said, Cunning Strike, it's a decent trick. It kind of fits in some of the like aggressive Jeskai decks where you're able to go like, Cunning Strike your small blocker. I don't care that I killed a bad creature. I just want to get 1 blocker out of the way, deal 2 damage to you, draw a card so I can draw into my, crippling chills and whatever other nonsense that you're trying to do to, win the game before their better cards take hold.
Right. Trigger my 2 prowess creatures, hit you for a bunch. I mean, that's where I see this thing really shining as well. It does make it a little awkward though, right? Because it's an instant and you have to fire that off on your turn, which is kind of a beef I've always had with prowess, is just that like, It makes you use your crippling chills on your turn or whatever, which I've always just felt was like a little inelegant with the game plan, but whatever. I mean, the fact that this is an instant, it just gives it more flexibility. It's not like you have to do it on your turn. So.
Yeah, it is all upside. I mean, yes, you are going to use it like essentially sorcery speed, like, you attack with your like Jeskai Wind Scout, kill their face down creature, and then deal an extra 2 points of damage plus the prowess trigger. So yeah, you sorceried it, but that's just because you chose to do that. You could also do it on your opponent's turn if you want.
Totally. Yeah, I agree with you though. I think that like there probably is a limit to how many Cunning Strikes you want, but I think that it doesn't start. I think that like 1, I think you would definitely want, and then you kind of go from there. All right, there's one more card that we'll read real quick, but this wasn't one of our official previews, but I just thought, well, we'll round out the cycle here. It's called Ethereal Ambush, and it's 3 green blue for an instant. And it says manifest the top 2 cards of your library. So for those of you that haven't heard manifest yet, to manifest a card, put it onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature. Turn it face up any time for its mana cost if it's a creature card.
So I just can't get over the fact that it's called manifest, because there was a convention in a magic convention in Northern California called Manifest.
Oh, really?
that I went to a bunch of times back, right, like when close to when Magic came out, 94, 95, 96, that sort of thing. And a lot of my formative years of playing Magic, these was my first like exposure to like bigger Magic tournaments. And now we're sitting here talking about manifests.
That's funny. they finally got their due.
Yeah. But jokes aside, I mean, this is, I think, easily the most powerful of the bunch here, since this is powerful. It's, very impactful. You don't get behind on tempo. It's card advantage. And you don't have to do anything to make this work. You just put it in your deck and cast it.
Yeah, and the morph thing is insane on creatures that aren't morph, because now all of a sudden your opponent has no idea of what to play around. There's also a lot of cards, which I previewed actually in the column this week, that can let you bounce your own creatures back to your hand. There was 2 of them that I previewed in the column that came out today. And so if it happens to be like a spell, like let's say you manifest your Icy Blast or whatever, and it's not doing much as a 2/2, there's cards that'll let you get it back to your hand and then cast it. It just seems like a really neat tool. And okay, so that's going to wrap up, by the way, the preview cards. But I did have one other thing that I should mention before we move on to the Sunset stuff, which is that normally this would be Judge Joe Bono coming on to give us the rules and interaction show for the upcoming set, Fate Reforged. But given how the scheduling and everything turned out with bringing you on, Luis, I decided to postpone that. So that's going to happen after the 2 set review shows. And we're going to bring Joe on and have him give us a bunch of clarifications. We used to bring him on after Luis, just because that's just how we did it. And then I think it was Ryan was like, why don't you bring him on before? And we're like, that makes a lot more sense, because the whole idea with the set review shows, of course, is to help people get ready for their pre-releases and releases and subsequent drafts and sealeds and stuff. And if they walk into the pre-release not really fully understanding how the new mechanics work, Well, then we didn't necessarily, prepare them as best as we could. So now we bring Joe in before the set reviews, and he goes over the new mechanics and lets us know all the little tricks and ins and outs of those and how they work. But for this set, we're going to go back to the old way and do it after.
Yeah, minor rules note is that, there's not much that'll help your opponent if you manifest like a Master of Pearls, because you can just turn it face up for 2 mana and it still triggers. So,
my God, that's right.
Yeah, that's just like the filthiest thing imaginable.
Wow, I did not think of that. That is ridiculous. 2 mana? Are you out of your mind?
Right, exactly.
Oh, that's sick. Oh, I can't wait to do that now I have a goal.
Yep.
Challenge accepted. Okay. All right. So let's get into the sunset part of the show. So, Luis, this is your first sunset show, but I'm going to just recap what these are for the listeners, for maybe if it's their first one. But this is something that John actually came up with during his stint as co-host here on LR. And I loved the idea the minute he said it, and we've done them ever since, which is, we do the preview stuff, right? We do the Judge Joe Bono show. We talk about, we do the set review shows. We talk about the new set when it comes out. And there's so much hype and looking forward to the new set. But you know what? We also drafted these sets for all this time. And it's really fun to kind of put a stamp on them and say, let's look back at the set that we just had and sort of, come up with some fun stories and little things to kind of look back and see what we thought about the format, and then also to recap it. I mean, there's historical implications here, right? Like, just things like, is this one of your favorite formats? Is this a format you can't wait to forget? Do we think that this format was a success or a failure, or what could have been better? What didn't work? Were there huge mistakes? That kind of stuff. And it's fun for us to kind of put on our game designer hats. And I should actually say for me to put on my game designer hat, because you put yours on every day.
I am, I am a professional game designer. That is an accurate statement.
It's funny too, because I think that people, I wonder if they realize that, like, how good of a fit you are for the show and along those lines too, because everybody knows who you are and what you've done on the Pro Tour and your Magic career and your content creation and stuff like that. But I mean, you're the third full-time co-host, and you're also 3 out of 4 who are professional game designers by trade, like to this day. And Brian could be. I've seen the stuff that he's done for, they do a thing called the Boo Cube, the Bring Your Own cube.
I remember reading about that, actually.
Yeah, and I've seen his stuff and heard him talk about it, and I just know he's got the right mental state or mind state and all that stuff to be a game designer. But you get to bring that aspect as well, and I love that. I love people who can kind of, pull the curtain back and look at the inner workings of a game behind it, because I've gotten better at it, but I'm not naturally good at that. I just sort of take the game and the cards at face value, and I can't imagine them being anything other than what they are. It's like, well, no, Glacial Stalker's a 4/5, and somebody could be like, yeah, but in testing it was a 4/6. I'd be like, what do you mean? It's a 4/5. Look at it. Like, it just doesn't click for me that it could be anything other than what it was. But game designers like yourself tend to have a different perspective and a different angle on it. And we'll just pile that on top of your resume along with everything else here.
On the other side of the spectrum, you also have Ben Stark, who claimed he would enjoy Magic just as much if they didn't have names or pictures and were just numbers.
I heard him say that. He told me that too. But that just makes the flavor draft jokes all more funny.
Yeah, and he's actually wrong there, by the way. It doesn't matter too much, but the pictures on Magic cards actually help you remember them. You don't reread a card every single time. Ben would find it much more difficult to play Magic if they were just numbers and no pictures. So
totally. Spend one day in the booth, right?
Yeah.
And you figure that out really quickly, because when people draw their cards, you get to see it for, just a quarter of a second. And without that picture on there, there's just no way we're picking off the cards like that.
I just like making up what they have in their hand and just elaborating on those lines of play.
And just hoping it works out. Oh, he conceded. I must have been right. All right. So let's take a look at Khans. Khans was a really great set in my mind. We'll kind of recap it when we get to the end, but I do have to say that I enjoyed Khans thoroughly. And it had a lot of great dimensions and depth to it as well. And we've got, I don't know, I wouldn't call it an award show, Luis, but we kind of go through and answer questions about the set in a way that like we ask ourselves the question and then answer it, which is kind of funny, but it ends up almost feeling like an award show. So the one I want to start with is, if you could summarize the set in one sentence, what would that be?
I actually think it's somewhat like the job of a quarterback in the NFL, which is, instead of finding the open man, you have to find the open clan. I mean, I actually think that the key to the format is figuring out which clan is open and just drafting that clan. I think if you did that, like if you were able to identify that every single time, then you would always have a great deck.
Do you consider this format well balanced?
I do. I think it is quite well balanced. I think part of the reason this format is good, and it is a good format, is that there's a wide range of decks you can draft, and there's no deck that's like oppressively dominant. Like in Magic 2015, for example, Triplicate Spirits was, I think, pretty detrimental to the format. If you opened a Triplicate Spirits, not only was your deck so good, it shaped how you draft. The card is just so powerful, it's so impossible to deal with. Whereas Khans, there's nothing really like that. There's a more flat power curve, and just the different decks can all be great, but there's no, like, it's not like, oh man, I have to draft Black White Warriors, or I have to draft Sultai Dredge. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can go, and even presented with the same amount of, or the same like sequence of cards, I think a lot of people will draft differently, but not look at one path or the other and be like, well, that was just clearly wrong, or that was just clearly right.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that we saw from the very get-go. I remember covering the Pro Tour when the set was new, and I like to try to kind of take a pulse of what the different teams and the limited guys from each of the teams is thinking, and kind of get an idea for what the pros are up to, because I have my own ideas coming in, but the format's always so new that none of them are settled, and my style is more to kind of go with the flow rather than try to like get on a rock and protect it and be like, this is the best color. I'm much more fluid than that. So it helps me a lot to kind of take the pulse of the players of the teams. And I have to tell you, the pulse varied wildly in the days leading up to that. So I was just like, because the thing about most pro players, and you know this very well, Luis, though you don't seem to have fallen for this quite as much as some of them, is that they tend to be very hyperbolic, and they will just get on an idea and just defend it and protect it and push it in your face. But I love that, because I'm just like, look, I'm just listening. I'm not trying to have like a big debate with you. I'm gathering information so that when I'm in the booth, I can say, all right, so we're going to watch Ben Stark, and I know that Ben really likes black in this format, so we'll see if he leans that direction, that kind of thing, right? But I got to say, those guys get on their soapbox and go, and they were talking in every different direction possible. There was people that were like, you draft 2 colors in this format. If you have to splash a third, you're not happy, but you do it. And then in the same, hour, I would hear another pro say, 5 color, don't look back. That's the only real archetype in this format, and everything in between too.
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons that I don't tend to fall into the same, hyperbolic camp that you're putting a lot of pros in, which I agree with you, by the way. It's completely there. Part of it actually is work. I found that speaking like that is not very useful, especially when you're talking about things that are difficult and hard to figure out. It stifles discussion to be like, well, this is the only deck you can draft. It's like, well, that's not the most useful way of putting that. You could say, I think this is the best deck, but saying it's the only deck that you can draft is usually just not going to be true, but you're also cutting off the interesting avenues of discussion when you say that. So I tend not to do that, and I honestly think this isn't that kind of format anyway, even though there are some formats like where I do tend to force decks to some more, not force decks, but like tend to lean towards decks more, and some formats, like, again, M15 was just a very recent one where if you could draft the white token deck, you just should. Yeah. I think anyone who's saying there's only this deck or only this deck is kind of selling the format short, and I don't think drafting optimally.
Yeah, I think you're right, and well, that's also part of the reason why you're on the show, just because that's something that we hear. We kind of try to fight that, right? Like we're looking to improve at Magic, and being hyperbolic actively discourages that. It also isn't an open-minded approach. You can always take bad advice and discard it, or advice that doesn't hold up to your scrutiny and discard it. But there's no downside in taking that advice from somebody who thinks they know, and you might even learn something small from it and just not listen to the rest. But yeah, this format has been all over the place. The sentence I came up with was draft morphs, then figure out the rest. Which
is also pretty good.
So this is my first time drafting morphs outside of Cube. And cube, there's only a few selected morphs, so it's not really a morph format. And I used to not like morphs. When my only experience with them was cube, I didn't like them because I felt like I never knew what they were because I just didn't memorize the morphs. And I thought, well, that's a crappy precedent to set, where it's just like, well, you just have to memorize all the morphs that happen to be in this cube. And I'm just like, that's just not, like, I'll memorize the cards eventually, but like just having no idea what that card might do for a player like myself it was just like, this isn't, I literally have no clue what could be under that. Like, you could pay 1 mana and flip up something tiny, or you could pay 10 mana and flip up some god card or whatever. I have no idea. And I found that frustrating. But then a lot of people told me, no, morphs are great. They're really, really great. And I'm like, and these are people that, whose opinions I respect. I'm like, okay. And then when we found out that morphs were going to be coming, I saw a lot of excitement, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to give these things a chance, because a lot of people say they're really awesome. And my God, morphs might be just my favorite limited mechanic. Like, I have just enjoyed playing them so much. I feel like they've changed the way the set plays out in such a favorable way, both easing the burden of a multicolored set, and also just letting you play Magic. Like, I have so many fewer games in this format where it's just like, oop, didn't get to play anything that game. Just never got to cast a spell. And, we all know that that's part of the game and it's something that we accept, but it's still not fun when it happens. And here, at least I feel like I'm in each game. Maybe I still don't win, but I have a shot. And the difference between I didn't get to play and at least I had a shot is huge. Like, for me, I'm just like, it is a complete game changer. And for somebody like me also who tended to prioritize morphs, I still think that morphs are underrated. Like, I think that people look at the boring morphs like Glacial Stalker and are like, I'll take this other thing over here. And I'm just like, nope, Glacial Stalker is still better than that. And the main reasoning that I have, and this is one of the big reasons why I put morphs so high and why I put them in that sentence, is just that, I don't plan on every game going smoothly for myself, right? I know I'm going to miss land drops. I know I'm not going to have all my colors every game. That's just how Magic works. And having morphs is such a nice bridge between that. I at least get to play my card. Maybe I never flip it up. Maybe I have to trade it, but I'm in this game. I get to make decisions. And that made me fall in love with morph. Like, this might be extreme, but I kind of wish that every set had morph. Like, maybe not heavy morph theme, but just that it was part of limited. Because, and I'd love to hear your thought on this, by the way, Luis, about this, what I'm going to say, because as a game designer, you'll have a better perspective on it than I do. But, one thing that gets talked about with Magic all the time is the variance, right? And you'll hear highly skilled pros lament the fact that there's variance and that some player that they think is worse than them beat them, and that shouldn't happen or whatever. But then you'll hear the smart people say, well, look, the reason why Magic's great is because this exists. It keeps players that aren't as good coming back. If they lost all the time, they would stop playing, and it lets them kind of hang around and get better. And, these are all things that I know to be true, but that's also a sliding scale, right? Like, the variance could be ratcheted up very high where it's just kind of not enjoyable to the point where it feels almost random. And it can also be brought down too low where all of a sudden the good players are just winning all the time and the bad players never get to win. But what about tweaking the knob just a little bit? Like, it's not likely that where Richard Garfield set the dial back in 93 and where it's evolved till to now is like perfect on that scale. And I feel like morph just like knock it down just enough that it just seems to take the edge off of some of these really feel bad scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, it is like the whole time, even before you started the actual variance discussion, I was thinking to myself like, a spike likes a mechanic that prevents mana screw, mana flood, and color screw at the same time.
Shocking, right?
and I am quite spiky. Like, I've got these different dimensions as a Magic player, and that is certainly one of them. And yeah, morph does that. It's just like cycling, like land cycling, for example, because what it does is it lets you play more land while also playing good late drops, so you don't get mana flooded, while also playing cards that you can have an impact in the early game, so you don't get mana screwed, and then, as you noted, morph also kind of fixes colors. So where does that fall on the, like, too much variance, too little variance scale? I mean, it's hard to tell. Magic is a pretty high variance game. It's a very high variance game, and that's part of what we like about it. Is I think that one of the biggest distinctions between, or when you're looking at like what kind of variance is healthy is like, is it hopeful variance? Is it hopeless variance? Because like, let's say you get mana screw, you get stuck on 2 lands and you lose, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, that sucks. No one's happy about that. No one would choose to have that happen. But imagine you kept a 2-land hand and your 3-drop, you had 2 awesome 3-drops in hand. Can you envision a scenario where you win that game?
Sure.
Yeah, of course, it's drawing the 3rd land.
Right.
You had hope the entire game. So that's not the kind of variance that lets you, or the kind of game that makes you just quit the game and say like, I'm not going to play this again. I'm not coming back. Whereas, when you played, like, let's look at an older format, for example. Let's say you played a game and your opponent cast like, counterspell, psychotog, fact or fiction, and you lost, and you didn't really know what was going on, but you just lost. Or even better example, you're playing against someone playing Affinity with Arcbound Ravager and Disciple of the Vault and Artifact lands, and you lose, and you're like, well, screw this, I'm not losing to Affinity, and you put in 20 shatters, and then you just lose again.
Right.
That's hopeless. How are you going to get out of that? And actually, it's not a coincidence that Magic was at its worst when Affinity was the standard deck of choice.
Right.
That was like one of the biggest threats to Magic because it was just completely hopeless. So I think making sure that people still have hope is really important. And I think, mechanics like Morph do help that, and mechanics like cycling do help that, because the game is still very high variance. You still are just going to lose these games. But yeah, like you said, sometimes you get mana screwed, but you still get to play 2 Morphs. You get to kind of like fight a little bit, and even if you end up losing, it wasn't one of those losses where you just didn't do a single thing. So
right, because those are the ones that really sting, right? Where you're just like, you're looking at your hand and you've got 6 cards in your hand, or you're discarding a hand size, and you're just like, well, didn't even get to play a single card. Good game, and you begrudgingly stick out your hand and move on. Where, like you said, sometimes you lose when you cast a Morph or 2 because your opponent's just curving out, or you never draw your 4th land or whatever. But God, I feel like, I wonder if we could get away with limited, for limited, some of these would sneak into constructed, but just having Morph be an evergreen mechanic, just jam it into every expert level set. On some level, maybe it doesn't have to be as prevalent as it was here. But anyway, I love Morph. I am pro Morph, and that's why I put in the thing. Also, it's just powerful.
I do have some somewhat bad news for you, but
okay, what is it?
So part of you said your complaint with Morph was that you didn't want to memorize all the cube morphs, and you were like always confused over what they could flip up. Like, you realize Manifest does that, right? You can now no longer really predict what your opponent's going to be flipping up. So if you put a lot of stock into that, then you may want to rethink your position.
Well, I think I've lessened this. Like, I think I felt that way initially, when I first started doing the cubes, just because I felt like this is already hard enough.
Yeah.
But honestly, that's interesting that you say that, because what if we use my initial cube experiences and just reflect that as a new player?
Yeah, I mean,
playing these new sets, like that probably mirrors that, right?
Where it's going to feel like they're going to have a face down creature, and you're like, what could that be? I have no idea.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. Because the thing that I felt when I was playing the cube was like, I'm already trying to figure out all of these cards and interactions that I just didn't know before, right? And maybe I can tell you what the card does, but I've never played it. I've never had anybody play it against me. And I'm still working through all of that stuff. And then on top of it, I just get to literally have a card that I have no clue what could be underneath. Like, this is just getting ridiculous. And I bet you that's how new players feel too, even when cons, right? Where they're like, well, I don't know what that morph could be. I have no idea. And I'm still trying to figure out, how to use my Archer's Parapet, or if I should block or not, or whatever. So
yeah, and it leads to some amount of decision paralysis too. Like,
yes,
your opponent has 6 mana untapped, and you've got a 4/4, and they have a face down card, and you're like, I don't know what that could be. I'm not attacking. So
right. Yes,
I don't think I would vote for Morph being an evergreen mechanic.
Yeah, you might be right about that. Maybe I went a little too far. Okay, here's a question that I actually just came up with, but I want to get your take on it, which is this a Prince or a Pauper format? And Prince and Pauper, I'm referring to an idea that BDM had, and he came on the show and we talked about it. And it's kind of categorizing a format as one where, the commons are the most important things, or one where maybe the rares, the bombs are the most important things. The Prince being the bomb heavy format, where it's kind of like, yeah, all the other cards are created equal. And then, he had a Titan, right? The game ended. Versus Pauper, where it's like you need to build synergy decks. You need to have decks that work well together. And if they have any single bomb, you're kind of like, whatever. I've got, Trumpet Blast and a bunch of tokens. It doesn't really matter. How did you categorize Khans?
I think it's a Prince format. I mean, I think that the good cards are enough notches above the average cards that they're going to be what's deciding a lot of the games. I mean, they still make up a small percentage of the cards like in the format, but when you look at a cards like Wingmate Rock or Icy Blast, Surak Dragonclaw, it's like these cards are so many levels above the commons that they do a lot of work kind of negating what went on in the game beforehand. Like you might have had a good game with some interesting counterplay, then your opponent plays a Wingmate Rock, you're like, well, that all didn't matter.
That didn't matter at all. Yeah, beating a rated Wingmate Rock, very difficult. I think another thing that contributes to that feel is the fact that the removal is overall mediocre at best. I mean, there's just literally no common instant speed, semi-unconditional, cheapish removal. That just doesn't exist. And then you have to get up to uncommon, where there's not very much of that either. You get Murderous Cut, which is great. But beyond that, you're still not getting much that is, again, instant speed and can just sort of kill anything unconditionally. Reach out across the table and kill it. Those things just don't happen that often. So it is harder to answer bombs in that scenario too.
Yeah, and if I wouldn't hold your breath on Doomblade coming back at common, I think that's cards like that have been identified as not common.
Yeah,
so,
that ship has definitely. I mean, the last time they printed it was uncommon, so
yep, and
it's gone.
I think that's where we're at. And that being said, there is room for commons to be better than they are in cons. My guess is that the commons and cons I think are a little below average in terms of power level compared to what you're going to find in, let's say, the average set in the next 3 years or the years prior. That's just how it broke. I mean, it ended up being such that cards like Savage Punch, Debilitating Injury, Woolly Loxodon are among the best commons, and those wouldn't even come close to the discussion in some other formats.
Right. Okay, next. This is an important question. What turned out to be the best archetypes?
I actually have to go back to my previous answer here, which is that the Open Clan was actually the best card deck you could be drafting. I think all the clans are close enough together that I actually don't think it's super important to know which was the best anyway, because it's the one that you're getting handed is the one you should be drafting.
Oh, that's a good answer.
That's just super important. I mean, like, for example, like Sultai could, I don't think Sultai is as good as, like, say, Abzan. I think Sultai is, or Mardu. I think both those are a little better. Mm-hmm. But if Sultai is the one that's open, you're going to have a better Sultai deck than you would have a Mardu deck or Abzan deck. So I think you just identifying that is really good. Also, there's, of course, like Black-White Warriors, for example, which is very, very good. So I think there are certainly real archetypes that you should prioritize. Like Black-White Warriors is better than Red-White Warriors is a good example of this.
Sure.
If I have a bunch of white cards and I have to decide whether to take a black card or a red card of the same power level or very close power level, I will take the black card just because I think that deck is better. But in general, you should be looking at trying to figure out what the couple people to your right are doing and not do that.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice. Yeah, I picked Black-White Warriors as my answer just for the fact that, like, if I sit down at a draft table and my only goal is winning, and the draft gods appear and say, "My son, you may choose your archetype," I would probably pick Black-White Warriors. Like, I think it's the most consistent, deadly, powerful. It's like it hits that consistency and power level cross section the hardest, where it only has 2 colors. It's the easiest to get your threats going. It has a powerful, consistent clock with a good long game. And it punishes slow decks. It can race fast decks. It has the ability to gain a bunch of life back if you're running the whole Russia battle plan, and which allows you to race really effectively. It's got finishers. Some of the best bombs in the format are in those colors. So I think that if I had to choose one, that would be it. But I definitely like your advice. All right, so this is similar. This is shifting gears a little bit, Luis. What were your favorite archetypes? What was your pet deck in this format?
Our pet deck has to be Goblin Slide.
Yeah, of course it is.
I drafted it on stream. I drafted it when I was recording. Like it's just the deck I wanted, and we talked about it even on when I was on the podcast. Like
you pioneered it, yeah.
I wouldn't say I pioneered it exactly. But,
I mean, nobody else drafts that deck. You're the one.
I also invented it, and I'll claim it as my own. Maybe because everyone else knows better. But really, what I mean Goblin Slide. It's actually less important that you have the actual card Goblin Slide. I'm more talking about Jeskai control. Like, one of the reasons I went into it, one of the drafts, was that I got an End Hostility, like, 4th pick in pack 1. You're trying to, like, put together cards like Treasure Cruise and Kill Shot, and then just find a couple, kind of finishers that can end the game, but you're really trying to win through card advantage. And Goblin Slide actually happens to work pretty well in that deck, because it makes your cantrips better, and your cantrips make your Treasure Cruises better, like cards like Defiant Strike, for example, or Crippling Chill. And overall, it just leans towards being a controlling deck. So it's a bit of a pet deck, and it's not a deck that I would say in general is going to be there to draft, because it requires some specific cards. But I did like drafting it a lot, and I actually did pretty well with it when I did draft it.
My pet deck was, well, I had multiples, which speaks complimentary of the format. 5-color. Was definitely the deck that I like to draft, but specifically it was Secret Plans 5-color. Like, it was all morphs, dual lands. Secret Plans is, 2, one deck I had 3 of them, which felt like 3 might be pushing it.
3 might be excessive.
Yeah. The second one felt pretty good. But the third one, at one point I did die with 3 Secret Plants on the table and 1 face down morph as my opponent attacked for lethal. It was not unexpected, but it was very sad. But yeah, I think that was a deck. I mean, I had Kenji come on the show, and he's like, dude, I've been drafting 5-color like every single draft, just forcing it basically, and doing really well. And I'm like, well, I'll try that. And then like 12 drafts later, I was still doing it and experiencing, above average success with it as well. So, and it was just a fun, like, it's just when you have to go back down to 3 colors after drafting 5, it just feels like super underpowered. You're like, really? Like, come on.
It's like you had 5 senses and now you're down to just 3.
Yeah. It's like somebody cut my nose off. I really missed it. But that was one of the ones. And then the other format that I kind of transitioned into was Sultai with white, which is kind of like the deck that Gerard was talking about. But he took a more extreme stance on it. But I did draft the no red deck pretty consistently for a while too. And find that, you basically draft a slow down, controlling, board stalling type deck and then grind them out with card advantage late. And I enjoyed doing that too in this format. And I also enjoyed that it was viable, because sometimes you play decks like that and they're just really not what you want to be doing. But in this format, I found that deck was perfectly serviceable, and I was pretty happy to be able to draft it.
Yeah, I always test that deck, and it does not always work out.
No.
There's some formats that are just not kind to it.
Yeah, and I remember in M15,
yeah. I'll be one of them.
Yes, I had it was actually at the GP that you covered in the second draft. I ended up with like a Sultai colored control deck, and I'm just like, this is just the opposite of where I want to be. Like,
yep.
I had sweet cards, like there would definitely be times and formats where if you showed me that deck, I would be quite excited to play it, and I was just like nothing but bummed out. I'm just like, I am not happy about how this deck turned out. But in this format, the cool part is that you can actually do it. Let's see, what else we got here?
I like taking a look at the most drafted card on Magic Online, because
that's a good.
It's a good barometer for like where you're at without like really trying to be. Like it does tell you, it does give you information that you weren't aware that you were like accumulating. So
yeah. So what was yours?
It was actually Kill Shot. Kill Shot.
Oh, really? Kill Shot.
And it's not strictly like, again, looking at this metric, it's not strictly like this is the best card, because clearly like Lightning Bolt's not going to ever be your most drafted card because no one ever passes it.
Right.
It's somewhere in between the card you can get the most and the card that you like a lot. Like, it's like those two things kind of like meet when you're looking at your most drafted card. But it is interesting to look. And actually, if you look at my top 4 most drafted cards, you'll notice a pattern. It's a Kill Shot, followed by Treasure Cruise, followed by War Behemoth, followed by Cancel. So
that is fantastic.
So if you're painting a mental picture here, it is exactly what I just said.
It's getting ugly.
Kill shots, treasure cruises, war behemoths, and cancels.
That's super funny. Mine, God, it's really funny. Now that you say that, I noted the top 4 or 5 or whatever when I was putting them in the show notes, but I wasn't really framing them in my mind. I'm like, oh, that card, that card, that card. But this is exactly the deck that I draft. That's super cool. So the first card is Dismal Backwater.
Yep.
Then Debilitating Injury, Abomination of Gadul, Abzan Guide, and Woolly Loxodon.
Hey, look, it's Sultai with white.
Yeah, it's like exactly the deck that I always draft. That's pretty cool. But yeah, and I was actually surprised / I kind of smiled when I saw Debilitating Injury was on that. Where are you at on that card? Like when I first saw it, I thought it was the best common, and then it went down a little for me, but not a lot. And I still have it as like either the best common or like one of the top, 1 to 3, they're somewhat interchangeable there. And I feel like other people have kind of gone down a bit on Injury. Where are you?
I started with it pretty high. I was like, yeah, this is the best common. It's just an efficient removal spell. There aren't that many of them. It turns out that's not really where it's at. I've never cut a card. I've never cut it from my base black deck. It's a very good card, and I don't mind taking it relatively early. But honestly, I think both Savage Punch and Woolly Loxodon are just better commons. I think
interesting.
I think Savage Punch because you can set up these great turns with it, and Savage Punch kills 5/5s. When you Savage Punch one of your 4/4s, it kills their 5/5, and Debilitating Injury just can't do that. And then Woolly Loxodon's just the king of the morphs, that's what we always call it, just because it trumps every other common when you flip it up, and almost all the uncommons too.
Yeah, so, I do love me a Woolly Loxodon. You know what's funny? The next card on my list is Savage Punch. Yeah. So I apparently jumped on that train as well at some point.
And I also found that people's overall valuation of Savage Punch never really kind of got to where I think it was.
I agree.
Whereas Debilitating Injury, I'm surprised you have it second. Like, I don't even know how you get all those. Like,
me neither.
People don't tend to pass that card as much. Like, it does not surprise me to see a 6-pick Savage Punch, but I rarely do see 6-pick Debilitating Injury.
Yeah, I don't know actually.
Probably because of people like you, actually.
Yeah, it must be. I don't know. Like I said, I still have it very high on my list, but I do remember having a conversation with Owen and Huey on the way back from an event. I randomly got seated next to them on an airplane, and they were just like, "What do you think about Savage Punch?" And I'm like, "It's been going up for me." They're like, "We think it might be just the best common," and at that point, I was like, "Whoa!" Like I hadn't quite gotten it to that point, but like when you see the extreme tempo swing that card can give, it's hard not. I mean, sure, we're talking about the upside of the card and not the downside. But the thing that I learned over the course of the format was it is very difficult to punish somebody for using Savage Punch. I mean, you put Savage Punch in a set like whatever M12 or something when we had the instant speed stuff and the really top tier removal available, and that card is way worse. I mean, there's some matchups where it would be a liability. And here, it just feels like you never get punished. Like the only card that I ever saw that was really good at punishing it was Force Away. That was the one that it was like, haha, gotcha. And you know what? It's still not that great. It's still just a 1-for-1. I mean, sure, sometimes they have an Obzon Charm or whatever, but like, of the stuff that you routinely saw, it was just like, yeah, I'll force it away. And you're like, okay, and then they just have to recast it and they're not happy. But like, that's not Doomblade, right? That's not like Savage Punch your guy, ? And it's like, oops, kill your dude. And then all of a sudden you just get this huge blowout. Like that just doesn't happen hardly ever because of the removal in the format. I think that was something that I underestimated at first about Savage Punch.
Yeah, if you put Savage Punch into, say, something like M10 where it's like Doomblade and Lightning Bolt, like it would not be that good just because your opponent could just trump it for 1 or 2 mana very effectively. But in this format, yeah, there aren't that many removal spells that are cheap. Like this is part of the reason that Murderous Cut is just insanely good and you should almost always take it, is that, there aren't that many ways to disrupt Savage Punch, and you can kind of catch your opponent tapped out, and it's cheap enough that you can just pick your spots with it. So also it has incredible synergy with like Obzon Guide. You can just gain 12 life right away. So
right.
I think Savage Punch is less. It's a combination of it being less vulnerable than it would be in other formats and the removal overall being worse, which makes the value of a 2-mana spell that can kill their 5/5 that much better.
Now, what about, this is a fun question. what was the funky rare? You know, that weird offbeat rare that you always hope to see and build around. I'm going to start with mine. And mine was Villainous Wealth. Every time I open that stupid card, I'm like, all right, we're doing it. Because what I realized early in the format is that Villainous Wealth is a good card, right? It's not just a splashy, stupid, like, oh, he's doing the Villainous Wealth thing, but everybody knows that that's just like not really up to snuff. Villainous Wealth actually is a good finisher in a deck that can get to the late game. I wouldn't call it particularly efficient. It is an expensive finisher at the least, but it does get you there, and it's hard to lose the game if you resolve a Villainous Wealth for 6 or more on X, for X equals 6 or more. And also, it just fits in, like, we just took a look at the cards that I drafted the most on Magic Online, and it fits right into that as well.
Yeah, not to copy your answer too much, but Villainous Wealth was actually the first card I picked in this format. When I opened my first pack in the first draft I did, I picked Villainous Wealth. And that
is awesome.
Honestly, it's right, it's right up my alley too. Like it's an expensive but somewhat inexorable finisher. You have to counter it to answer it, which is pretty difficult to do. And it's the kind of card that I just love playing with. It's, sets you... The kind of deck that abuses Villainous Wealth is already the kind of deck I like drafting. But in order to provide a little variety, I'll go with my, I guess, second pick, which is a Keru Spell Snatcher.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a morph that when you unmorph it, it exiles any spell, then you can play that spell. Like whenever you could normally play it. And I didn't realize it could counter creatures initially. So... Mm-hmm. When you unmorph this, when your opponent puts anything on the stack, it's just a huge blowout.
And it is such a huge blowout. Yeah. Oh my God. I've had some just disgusting things happen from that.
Yeah. I mean, the card is incredibly powerful, but it's also like pretty hard to use, especially in draft. Like in sealed, I think the card is fantastic. In draft, I think it's a little more difficult because in order for you to really use it, you have to have it in play, 6 mana up, have your opponent cast a spell into it, which generally means you have to not just be losing on the board.
Yeah.
Because especially if your opponent kind of like senses that this is what you got. If they're winning on the board, they can just not cast spells. But if you get to a stalemate or you're ahead, even slightly, and then your opponent plays something and you flip up a Spell Snatcher, like, that's just game.
That's just it. Yeah. And it's like the ultimate insurance plan. You feel so safe. Yep. You just have, the onus is just completely not on you to do anything, and you get to just steal whatever they do. I love that card. I'll probably save this story that we'll have a little story time. But I had a pretty insane sequence on one of my draft videos in this format with Spell Snatcher that my opponent, I think they made a mistake at some point, but even then it was still just a really cool.
Was it getting into the ring against the great Marshall Sutcliffe?
Was that their mistake?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that wasn't it. It was super funny though. Hell, let's just skip to that one. Let's talk about, maybe your favorite story from the format or just a story. I mean, you're a great storyteller. I've heard you hear tell lots of stories, and they're always entertaining. Do you have any that stand out? I can tell mine first if you want a minute.
No, I'm going to go first because mine also involves Keru Spell Snatcher.
Okay. You're going to spelljack my story?
Yeah. There's actually 2 separate ones, and they're both at Grand Prix Nashville, which is a team Grand Prix. So it was, me, Paul Chian, and Ifro. We build our decks, and I take the Jeskai control deck with Keru Spell Snatcher and 2 Treasure Cruises.
Of course.
Which is a shocker, but, that's where we were.
You took one for the team there.
Yeah, exactly. And let me tell you, if Keru Spell Snatcher is better in sealed than it is in draft, it's that much better in team sealed because everyone's deck just has these better finishers, and people are less likely to build these super focused aggro decks. At least we rarely ran into them. And that's the format where Keru Spell Snatcher is insane.
Yeah.
So we get a feature match round 1, and I'm playing round 1, game 1. I don't really know what my opponent's playing. Ends up my opponent's playing some kind of Jeskai deck too. And I've got a Keru Spell Snatcher in play. And on turn 6, my opponent doesn't really have a ton, but I don't really have a ton. But they're ahead on board. So I'm like, I can leave up the Spell Snatcher, or I can just play something. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to leave up Spell Snatcher. I don't know what my opponent could have. My opponent attacked me and then played a Wingmate Rock. So I'm just like, I probably made the right decision here. So I flipped up Spell Snatcher, untapped, attacked with Spell Snatcher, played Wingmate, and yeah, I was like, all right, this is gonna be a good day.
You triggered the raid with the Spell Snatcher too.
Yep.
That's fantastic.
And then that was almost as good as the other one, which is I got to play 3 Treasure Cruises in the same game because I cast my 2 and I Spell Snatchered my opponents.
That is dirty. And you almost deck yourself?
I came close, but I managed to win with damage before that happened. And I told Benes that I had cast 3 Treasure Cruises. He's like, you're lying. I'm like, no, I really did. He's like, you didn't put 3 treasure cruisers in your deck. Ifro wouldn't let you. I'm like, well, I didn't say I did that either. He's like, oh, I see. You put 3 treasure cruisers in your deck. I was like, no. I spell snatchered one. So
that's awesome.
Those were the height of my spell snatchering, but I had a bunch of good moments that day.
Mine was absolutely hilarious. So I find myself in a position where we're stable. I'm not able to actually attack my opponent for damage because he got off to a relatively quick start and had me at low life. I think he had, his only creature I believe on board was Whirlwind Adept, the hexproof 4/2. And I've got Spell Snatcher turn face down. And my opponent's drawn a couple of cards and hasn't done anything. And I'm at 4 or 5 life. Like I'm at either 4 or 5. I'm on the verge of death here. But I've got a Spell Snatcher. I've got a card in my hand. I can't cast it because I'm too scared to not leave up Spell Snatcher for a turn. So we're kind of draw going. And he's at 18 or whatever or something. I can't remember. He's at high life or whatever. And I'm not able to pressure him. And so he doesn't do anything for a few turns. And then out of nowhere, he starts tapping mana when he draws his card. I'm like, okay, so he must have drawn another creature finally, right? And he plays Temur Charm. He puts Temur Charm on the stack. And I'm like, oh, man. I'm like, I actually would have lost to that because he's going to make my creatures not be able to block. They all fit the description of whatever it is, power 3 or less. And he's going to get a trigger and he's going to be able to attack and kill me with that stupid Whirlwind Adept. I've got like 4 blockers, right? And somehow this Whirlwind Adept is going to be the thing that kills me. So I'm like, okay, well, I got to steal this. I can't get around it. So I Spell Snatcher his Temur Charm. And so now I've got Temur Charm. So then he taps 3 more mana and he plays another copy of Temur Charm. And so then I cast my free Temur Charm and he didn't leave the mana up. So I got to mana leak his Temur Charm so that I didn't die.
And he could have just done this in response to the Spell Snatcher.
That was the mistake. Yes, he could have absolutely done that, but I don't think he thought it through, because it's like, sometimes when they flip up Spell Snatcher, you're just like, oh, shoot. And, you don't really think about what you could do. But yeah, he didn't. And I got to mana leak his second. Somehow he had a second copy, even though the first one was lethal. And I got to counter it. So that was pretty fun.
So we can both agree that Kira's Spell Snatcher is just the best card in the set when it comes to building story equity.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. Because your story actually reminded me of it. What about this? What about what's your biggest groan test? And the groan test is something we've talked about all the way since the Ryan days here on LR, which is, your opponent plays a card and you're just like, ugh, God, like, what am I supposed to do here, right? It's just one of those cards that just makes you just shake your head. Like, sometimes it's just due to raw power. Sometimes it's because it's annoying. Sometimes you're just like, oh, great, here we go. One of those things. What was for you the one that you found just most like, ugh, when your opponent cast it?
Well, I mean, Wingmate Rock is the obvious answer because I think it was just the best card in the set. And when your opponent cast it and you didn't have a Kiro Spell Snatcher at the ready, you just lost. But I would say the more common case, honestly, is like you unmorphing something and them unmorphing a Woolly Loxodon. I mean,
yeah,
that's not a scenario that you want to get yourself into because like you want to plan to like not be, going up against their morph when you don't really know what it could be because you could just get trumped like that. But honestly, sometimes you just had to like jam and hope it worked. And whenever they unmorphed Woolly Loxodon, it's like, ugh, like you could just never win. Like,
yeah, especially when you had like the Snowhorn Rider, which is supposed to beat most of the morphs, and it's just like, really? Yeah, that happened. That was definitely, I was thankfully on the good end of that most of the time just because I drafted Woolly Loxodon a bit higher than most, I think, so I ended up with a ton of them. One of them that I found of just like, I always, kind of look at the board, look at my hand, look at the board, like, what am I going to do? Was when they slammed Bellowing Saddle Brute on turn 4 with or without raid, but let's just say with raid. And like the removal in the set just didn't match up against Bellowing Saddle Brute in a remotely reasonable way. And the creatures didn't either. And you're just like, well, I guess in 3 turns I can go for a risky double block on your Bellowing Saddle Brute, but I'll be at 4, and that was kind of the plan from there on out.
Yeah, Bellowing Saddle Brute is just an amazing card. And the decks that did that also frequently had the other one, which was they're on the play. They play morph, you play morph. They hit you, and then they either play the Mardu Heart Piercer and just kill your guy.
Oh, that's a good one.
or they play the War Shrieker and then play another morph, and like in both scenarios, you're like, well, can't win.
Yeah, can't do that. They somehow got a Black Lotus out of the deal, and their Black Lotus attacks for 3.
That ruins at the Pro Tour, actually. I had a morph out, and my opponent had a Leaping Master, 2 and a white to give it flying, a 2/1. My opponent goes, turn 4, land, Marty Warshrieker, give my guy flying attack. I'm like, what? What exactly are you doing? He's like,
no.
Play this, give this flying attack. I'm like, that's not how that card works.
Wow.
like your card has raid. It doesn't just add 3 mana. So he's like, oh, well, in that case, go. Because, I mean, he had played the Marty Warshrieker. Like,
right.
That had already happened. So
that's super funny. It is funny how that works with cards with extreme upside like that. How people get so used to having, like an example. I think it was like Wild Nakatal's just a 3/3 in everybody's head, right? It's just never anything but a 3/3, and it's just funny how people just take for granted the fact that, look, you're getting a 3/3 for 1 mana, or you're getting this hill giant that just spews out 3 mana. Like, you could at least meet the requirements that it asks you to do.
Yeah, I actually have seen Wild Nakatal like chump block an opposing Wild Nakatal because it's like you don't have the planes.
Right. What crappy card do you seem to find yourself playing? Maybe more than you should.
I mean, I guess it's not crappy exactly, but War Behemoth is a card that sneaks its way into a lot of my decks.
Oh yeah.
Paired with other crappy cards like Weave Fate, for example. And one of the reasons I like Weave Fate is I just love playing these decks where you just leave all your mana up every turn. You just operate at instant speed. And sometimes your opponent, they have this notion they're going to get so clever, and they're going to play around your cancel, and they're just going to say go, and then you're like, all right, draw 2 cards.
Oh, that is the most backbreaking. I've been on the bad end of that and just been like, oh no. You feel like you're falling so far behind when you do that.
Yeah, and I'm not going to sit here and defend Weave Fate as a card because it's not a great card, but when you have these decks that operate at instant speed, it's the kind of card that actually does play a reasonable role, which is let you use your mana on a turn where your opponent's trying to make it so you can't use your mana. Also, it draws you to Treasure Cruise and then makes that cruise cheaper. See, that's synergy.
Ah, there you go. Oh, this one. Well, this one's this one's kind of funny. It's perhaps a bit dated. Your most often 24th card.
Yeah, so Marshall sent me these show notes, and I see that, and I'm just like, 24th card? Which format are you playing?
Yeah, no, that was that was a victim of a copy.
My 23rd card is also a land.
Yeah, that was a copy paste error there. Normally that would be a good question, but in this format, perhaps not as much.
So I think I played 16 lands once this entire format, and that's when I was Black-White Warriors with like 4 1-drops and like 6 2-drops.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, I mean, we discussed about how Morph lets you just play a few extra lands. You'd much rather play an 18 or 19. I played 19 more than I played 16, which is like very rare for formats.
Yeah.
Because when you have morphs, you get to jam a bunch of 3-drops in your deck that then start unmorphing on 5 and 6 mana, which means you have 5 and 6 drops and you have 3 drops, which means you can play a few extra lands because it's way worse to have too many lands than too few. And when you have too many lands, you still have plenty to do. So yeah, I guess War Behemoth is going back to this. This is the kind of card that's always one of my last editions, but it generally does sneak in there.
Yeah, for me, you know what it was? It was Scout the Borders, which you would think it would fit into what I was doing. You know, it enables the delve stuff to happen, and it kind of gets you lets you hit your land drops or lets you find your bombs or whatever. But for some reason, I tend to not like cards like that just don't do anything to the board. It's effectively a very expensive cycler with some upside. And, you know, for me, those cards I always draft it and I think, okay, this is the deck for Scout the Borders. I'm going to play it. And then I just never do. It always ends up being just on the bench. I mean, I'm not saying I've never cast one of these in this format. I have. I think it can be good in the right deck. But even the decks that I want, which feel like the right deck, it never seems to quite get there for me. And I think this one ended up being on the bench a lot more than not.
That's interesting. I did not have that experience with Scout the Borders where...
You scouted many borders? Yeah,
it's not that I scouted many borders. It's that when that was in my deck, it was actually a good card in my deck. So I think it was like, I have somewhat the same opinion of you on the card. It's just I would tend not to play it unless it was enabling my delve cards. That's basically what the card's for. And I actually think it was quite good in the Sultai Delve deck where you're just trying to play turn 4 Hooting Mandrills and something else, like turn 3 Scout the Borders or turn 3 Morph, either one. Turn 4 Hooting Mandrills for 1 mana. And that was a pretty good sequence of plays. And those are the kind of decks where I wanted Scout the Borders. The decks where I didn't particularly want Scout the Borders, I just didn't play it in there.
Yeah, it was weird. I don't know. Oh, here's a good one. This is listeners love this one. So, what's the Marshaliest card? And we've got what's the LSV-iest card as well. So for me, this wasn't even remotely close. It was Ice Feather Aven. Ice Feather Aven, the Ice Dad, and I locked eyes when I first saw it spoiled, and we have not broken that gaze since. I love this card. It has not disappointed. It's in my commander deck now. Like, Ice Feather Aven is exactly what I want to be doing at all times in a game of Magic, and I will take it over most anything in the format, and feel like I'm fully justified in doing so. That card is just great.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. You also picked a very powerful card, so
yes, I did. I didn't mess around. It's not just a niche thing, but like if there's the card that I identify with, the one that I want to play, that my style, it's Ice Feather Aven. What about you? What's the LSV-iest of all of them? I wonder what it could be.
It's really tough. It's really hard to come up with an answer to this question, but I guess I'm just going to go with the card that's my Twitter background and Facebook background, and I cast in every single format, which is also coincidentally not a powerful card either. I'm going to go with Treasure Cruise.
Treasure Cruise, absolutely, all aboard.
And it's not as powerful in a lot of the formats as it is, like unlimited as it is in like Modern, for example, where I think it's actually going to get banned. But yeah, Treasure Cruise really does exemplify a lot of what I want to do. First of all, it draws 3 cards. I like doing that. Second of all, it's expensive. I like that.
It's at the sweet spot. Yeah,
my best interests.
8 mana.
And it rewards you if you do some work. I love doing that. Like, I actually like drafting synergy cards, and I think Treasure Cruise very much is that. It's a card that if you put in the legwork, if you put in their cantrips and you put in the cheap interactive cards that can trade, and here I'm not even just talking about Lunar, I'm just talking about all the formats. It rewards you very greatly, and I like getting rewarded greatly. That's another thing I like. So.
It is a big reward. Yeah, that I think I could have guessed Treasure Cruise for you. Here's one that we do every time. What's Marshall's soapboxiest card? That's a question that John came up with back in the day, and I think the answer is Molting Snakeskin again. It's tough because what I want to do for the show is make sure that we take the time to explore all of the options for a given card. And there will be options for most cards in the set, even if 95% of the time those options don't come up. It's important to know when they do, so that if you find yourself in that position, you know how to draft the Molting Snakeskin deck or whatever. But that doesn't... Like, Molting Snakeskin for me is a card that I have seen cast and be somewhat effective sometimes. But I have managed to not play it throughout the whole format, and I've gotten along just fine. Thank you very much. Like, I don't feel like I'm missing out much on stupid Molting Snakeskin, and whenever anybody casts it against me, I'm quite happy. I'm like, great, like let's get them, no problem. And that's probably the one that's led to the most complaining or soapboxing from me, from people who have emailed or whatever and said, "Oh, Molting Snakeskin's fine, you can play it." And I'm like, look, I'm not telling you what to play, but I'm saying it's not a good card. Which also leads me to a story. I have actually cast Molting Snakeskin, and I'm embarrassed to say it.
But it's off Villainous Wealth.
And it's off Villainous Wealth. And Rashad knows that I don't like Molting Snakeskin. He doesn't either. And he was walking by when we were at an event, and I had just resolved Villainous Wealth. I was giddy. And I was, kind of, everything was on the stack. He's like, wait a minute. And I'm like, no. Like, it doesn't count. It's not from my deck. And he whips out his phone and, immediately is putting pictures on Twitter of me casting Villainous Wealth. And I'm just like, you monster. Or not Villainous Wealth, Molting Snakeskin. But that is the only time I had Molting Snakeskin in play. And I was able to pay for the regeneration thanks to being all 5 colors. So I had all my bases covered.
Yeah, I think if you were to rephrase the question as, what's the worst card you lost to in a Pro Tour? Molting Snakeskin will also be my answer.
Oh, no.
So,
bad memories.
Yeah, I lost to some nice ones at that Pro Tour. I lost to Mardu Splashing Singing Bellstrike, too. So I don't don't know where the soapbox is located, but I would like to stand on it.
Yeah, well, we'll help you find it as we move forward.
Actually, that card I think is the worst that people think is good is Singing Bellstrike. You know, Singing Bellstrike, in the words of Andrew Cuneo, all it does is give your opponent's creature vigilance.
I have seen people do that. I have seen people on 6 mana cast that thing pre-combat on a tapped creature.
Yeah.
And then go, I'm going to attack now. And I'm like, I don't know if I would have made that play exactly as the guy untaps his Abzan Guide and blocks. It's
right.
like, oh no.
Multiple times at the Team Grand Prix, I saw Singing Bellstrike just Viscera one of their opponent's creatures. I had it happen to me, like where my opponent had Singing Bellstruck, one of my 3/3s, and I just untapped it to block a 2/2. I saw it happen when Shahar, Tom, and Paulo were playing. And this is in a Team Grand Prix where there's 2 other people on the opponent's side who should be able to spot this.
Who should be able to yell at you and say no. In fact, I think that actually did happen on camera.
Yeah. Not only yell at you to stop, not make that play, but also prevent you from putting it into your deck.
Yeah, I agree, especially in Sealed. The only deck that I've seen Singing Bellstrike be reasonable in is the Jeskai aggro deck with all the prowess triggers. Because, Singing Bellstrike in the early to mid stages does take a creature out of the equation, and it also triggers prowess. But as the game wears on, that card gets so much. I mean, the fall off on it is dramatic. A turn 2 or turn 3 Singing Bellstrike off of or maybe let's call it a turn 4 Singing Bellstrike after casting a 2-drop and a 3-drop, especially if one of them's like a Wind Scout or something like that, can be pretty nice. That creature's not untapping and you can keep the pressure going. But man, once they're able to untap it even once, that card is just shredded. Like it falls off so quickly.
They never have to attack again. They have a blocker. They're just up a card, or they've got nothing better to do. Vigilance it up.
Yeah, and that I've done that. I've seen that happen. What card do you still have to read when it's cast against? Those cards that you just don't quite see often enough, but then they like, wait, what is this exactly again? And you have to pick it up. Do you have a card like that?
No, I memorize everything because mostly because of greatness.
Wow, it must be nice.
Actually, jokes aside, for me, it's doing coverage is that I just have to know all the cards because I want to be able to, if not speak intelligently, at least speak about all of them. And you don't really have enough time to really, really like identify exactly what every single card does. That being said, some of the charms I will make sure I know what all the clauses are.
Yep, because there's so many different things on all of those.
I think you really should never be ashamed to read a card at any point in the game.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't care if you're playing in the finals of a PTQ or whatever, or round 10 of a Pro Tour. You should, if you have any inkling that you might be misunderstanding something, you're way better off just reading it than making a mistake. Making a mistake because of that is way dumber than looking potentially silly because you're reading, a card you quote unquote should know. So
yeah, totally. Yeah, for me, the cards that tend to creep into this category, because like I could read you the text on any card in the set, I think, but it's the ones that either are uncommon rare, mythic rare, so you just don't see them as often, and I haven't played with them in my deck or against them enough to just know. Like one card that came to mind.
Like Molting Snakeskin, for example?
No, well, kind of, yeah. Actually, I do know what that one does, just because I've had to speak against it, is like Raider Spoils, right? Like I can tell you what the card does, I know what it does, but when they read it, I'm always like, wait a minute, I got to double check this to make sure that like it doesn't give it +1/+1, it's just +1/+0. And like, it's when the Warriors hit me, right? It's 1 life, right? Yeah, okay. And just like check off these little boxes like that. Another one that comes to mind is Retribution of the Ancients.
Yeah, where you remove X counters to give a creature -X.
Yeah, and it's like, can I remove it for multiple creatures? Do I have to remove all the counters? Do I have to pay X? Do I play black? It's always just like, it's always a double check thing for me where I'm just like, I better just make sure. But for some reason, those ones seem to follow me around. What's the green one called? Hardened Scales?
Yeah,
that one too.
And I've heard rumors that Warrior Spoils is optional. But every time I've hit with a warrior, I don't really see a way not to draw a card. So
yeah, no, those rumors are not substantiated. Let's see here. Oh, there was another one that I really wanted to do next, and now I seem to have missed it. Are there any that are standing out to you here?
Well, one that I think is kind of interesting is what card that if you put in your deck makes your deck worse. Like what's the worst card?
Mm-hmm.
And I think while something like Altar of the Brood might be just like the actual worst card, or like Lens of Clarity is one that seems to trick people a lot. And let me just get this clear. Even though Manifest is out, you should not be putting Lens of Clarity in your deck.
Right.
You're just down a card. It doesn't do enough to make up for the fact that you're down a card. And I think that as satisfying it is to have all the information, to know what all your opponent's morphs are and what their top card is when you're playing around Manifest, like, it's still just not a good card. You really should you should not be playing it. Tie Game Scheming is another one that I'll go ahead and say it against, because it does a lot of stuff, but it doesn't do good stuff. You're, again, down a card. I mean, as it turns out, being down a card is a really big deal. So I think that it is really, really important to just not put cards like this in your deck, even though they enable Delve, even though they're good. And so, theoretically, you could have Lens of Clarity out, and you could plan out when you're going to manifest to get full value, but honestly, the difference between that and just randomly doing it is worth part of a card, but not a full card. So, in general, just be very wary of cards that look like they deliver a lot, but really leave you, at -1, because I mean, that -1 matters way more than all the like fancy tricks they're doing. So
yeah, that's a trap that people get caught up in, and that's a big part of what the set review shows are for as well. Tie Game Scheming got an F from both Brian and I, for example.
F for fantastic? Or?
No, that's not what it stands for. I don't think it stands for anything but the worst grade possible. And that's something that'll come up a bunch as we talk about the next set as well.
My favorite grade is from work. When we give something an F+, it's even worse than an F, because it means you actually took the time to fully think about it and give them a little bit of credit, but it's still really horrendous. So.
Yeah, that really does put a dagger of a twist on the end of it, an F+.
So we give out F+ as needed.
I like that. That's pretty good. What about the format as a whole? What were some of the wins? And I'm talking about from like a design development standpoint. What were some of the things that you thought about it overall? The mechanics, how did the set fare? What were some of the wins, the losses? You're a game designer. I'm really curious to hear what your perspective is on this.
I think there are a lot of wins. I think that, gold sets are awesome. People love them. Tri-lands are just incredible design. Those were done before, but they're great, and these are doing new ones, and it's something everyone loves. It just feels so satisfying to play a land like a tri-land, because it's just so good, but it's also balanced. It's not broken, right? Like a Vivid Land, for example, is too powerful and had like the counters and was like a little fussy and let you play Cloud Thresher, Wrath of God, Cryptic Command. Like, that's not good. Whereas the tri-lands are just good, clean magic. So I think overall the set did a really good job of accomplishing its goals. Actually, one of the things that always bugged me that's kind of a nitpick is there's a number of different cards that care about power and or toughness, and the numbers are all different. And I think that's kind of sloppy. So, like, to give you an example, I guess, Suspension Field and Abzan Charm and, like, Sultai Flare, like, some care about 3s, some care about 4s, some care about toughness, some care about power, like Keru Bloodsucker, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's this sub-theme of, like, there's Ferocious, right, that cares about 4s, for power. There's also a couple cards that care about 4 toughness, and some set the number at 3, and I think that makes it so much harder to like grasp naturally what's going on with all these cards. Like, a lot of the cards you mentioned that you need to read again, I think wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these cards are either cards people need to read more often, or cards they get wrong and end up having a kind of negative experience as a result. So I think when you're setting like a characteristic you care about, it seems pretty good to like try to be consistent in that. And I feel like having a couple one-offs that aren't consistent there introduce this kind of like weird kind of like dissonant sub-theme for me. So that's a bit of a minor nitpick, but it is there, and it did, I think, take a little bit away from the set.
Yeah, I think for me, I thought the set fared very well. Overall, one of the things I really look for in a set is balance, diversity, interactiveness, and then depth. Those are kind of the things that I really look for in a set. I want it to be balanced. I don't want it to be like, well, you got to draft black, and then if you don't draft black, the other colors are just subpar comparatively. So now you have this arms race where it's like, well, I'm in black, and then somebody's got to bail, and like, but everybody knows. I flash back to like Zendikar, which, black was the best color, and by a fair bit. And you could do other things, but like if you opened a really good black card, like you kind of, I always remember feeling like I was kind of on rails at that point, where I'm just like, well, here we go. Let's hope I'm not finding too many people. But you kind of felt compelled to do so. In this format, I didn't feel that way. I felt like, yeah, I mean, we've obviously identified some of the better strategies, but you could definitely win with strategies that weren't, the best ones. And as far as diversity goes, same thing. Like I like to be able to play a bunch of different types of decks, not just colors, but types of decks. I like to be able to beat down and leverage some combat tricks, some removal spells, and a good curve to try to go that direction. If I feel like my opponents are playing, decks that are too slow or too dirtily with their mana. But I also like to be able to play those decks and still have a good shot to win, where I can say, all right, I've got a Villainous Wealth. We're doing it. And now I'm going to try to slow this game down and make it go on forever and ever and try to resolve a huge Villainous Wealth and not feel like I'm just scrapping equity to do it, right? Because you can do that in any format. It's just some of them punish you so hard for taking that stance. And here I felt like, no, I can win a draft with this. Like this is, as long as I know which cards are right and how the curve works and how the things are put together, I can actually do that. And I thought that was really good. Interactiveness is interesting. It's something I haven't really fully gotten my head around yet, but because the removal in this set was low, it was not very good, but that might just increase the interactive, feel of the set, just because now, like, it's not just kill your guy and attack. It's like I actually have to deal with combat damage and maybe more combat tricks or morphs being flipped up and all that. And I thought that morphs added so much to the interactive feel of the set. In one hand, it took some of it away from you, because if you attack with your morph with 5 mana and they don't have 5 mana in a morph, you just don't get to block. Like, that just didn't happen. So that made it less interactive. But when you both had 5 mana and there was this sort of dance that you talked about earlier, where it's like, well, I attack with my morph, mine's a Woolly Loxodon, and I have 6 mana or whatever. Now I know that I can trump yours, but with any other morph, that might not be the case. Even an Abzan guy could get blocked by, a Glacial Stalker and just get eaten. And you always have to consider that. And I always found that to be pretty cool too. Overall, nothing really jumped out to me as like, well, here's the obvious best deck that you just have to take. Like I said, I picked Black-White Warriors as the best cross-section of consistency and power, but to me, it wasn't like infinitely better than any, than any of the other strategies. And I really appreciated that. The other thing I look for is depth. And like, I think that Khans hit a depth that I'm comfortable with, but wouldn't mind going deeper on. The deepest set I've played has been Innistrad, and that was quite deep. And Khans, I think, was like one build around me uncommon, like Goblin Slide / Quiet Contemplation being slightly better or having a little bit more of a straightforward strategy to it, away from being maybe the deepest. Because I thought that Secret Plans was beautiful. It required some cost. It was 2 colors. It didn't do anything when you played it, but it also rewarded you in meaningful onboard ways. And then down the line, when you started morphing, I thought that, if there was one more Secret Plan style card available, I think that this set would be super, super deep. But as it was like, going to the pool and you're feeling like, yeah, I could probably touch the bottom, but I'm not going to, I'm not standing up in the kiddie pool either. And that felt just about right to me.
And is that, a comparison a little different because you're very tall? Is that some kind of tall brag? Like, you need an even deeper pool than other people do to reach the bottom?
Yeah, that's where I was ultimately going with this. Before we move towards wrapping up, Luis, first, if you have any other thoughts, but also, where does this rank? You've drafted way more formats than I have, overall. And I'm curious to hear, is Khans going to be one of your all-timers? Is it merely thumbs up, good format, would play again? Is it kind of like, shrug, if they bring it back, I might run it? Where does it sit for you?
I think it's going to rank somewhere in between, great format I'd play it again and my all-timers. Like, and part of it's kind of funny because I think Innistrad and Rise of the Eldrazi are my top 2. And some of the other formats I have up there, I suspect are slightly like I'm viewing them through rose-tinted glasses, where like I really love drafting Tempest Stronghold Exodus when it's on Magic Online, or I really love drafting the full set of Champions of Kamigawa or Mirrored and Darksteel draft. But some part of me thinks like if I drafted those sets like with a bunch of people who knew what they were doing, like now, like in a modern 8 form Magic Online. If I did that a bunch, they actually wouldn't stand up as well as Khans. And part of it is that I just like drafted them as in formative, some of my formative Magic years. So I think Khans is a great format. I suspect I'll revisit it, and I had a lot of fun drafting it. I mean, I think, like you said, it hit on a lot of different notes that I'm looking for: complexity, depth, and all the things that lead to replayability. A lot of interesting decisions, and yeah, any like original Ravnica, for example, I think was pretty excellent, and this feels a lot like Ravnica. I think I have original Ravnica pretty high, and I think Khans is pretty close to it. With unfortunately Return to Ravnica a little lower than that. I felt like that one didn't have quite the punch of the original.
No, it didn't. I had high expectations for it, and I thought it was a fine draft format. I've drafted it a ton, but it didn't have that same vibe. I think for me, Khans it is, and this could be a function of a smaller sample for me of formats to choose from, but it does actually enter my pantheon. It's going to be in my top 5. I haven't figured out exactly where, because you never quite know until the format's actually gone. That, like, when you're still playing it, it's easy to get excited about it and to have it all fresh in your head. But when it's gone, when next fall's set comes out or whatever, that's where you look back and you're like, I remember when Innistrad finally rotated, and I was really sad. I was just like, God, I don't get to do this anymore. And I had drafted that stupid set every single day, like all the way through. I just never stopped. And I just remember being like, sigh, it's over, and I don't know. I don't know how I'll feel about Khans, because that's not going to happen until the spring set comes out. But for now, I have enjoyed it thoroughly. I found it, like I said, it hit all those things that I really want it to hit, from excellent to good enough, and I'll be pretty excited to come back and draft it. The one thing I'm really curious about is, like, if I'll remember, it's a complex format. Right? Like, there's a lot going on. You have to remember the morphs. You have to know the costs on all the morphs and everything. And I'm just wondering if in a year and a half, when I come back to draft Khans, if I'm just going to open it and be like, I don't remember what to do here.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I don't know. Magic trains your memory in such a strange way that, like, I can name thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Magic cards. Whereas if you ask me to hold that many discrete objects in my head that weren't Magic cards, I'd have like a lot more trouble. I suspect we'll do pretty well revisiting Khans and just instinctively kind of like remembering all these morphs when the time comes to to take a look.
I think what'll happen is I'll open up my first pack and there'll be a land in it, and I'll be strangely attracted to the land, and I'll be like, I don't know why I'm taking this land, but here we go, and then I'll figure it out from there. Yeah, that is true. All right, so why don't we move towards wrapping up here. First, I want to remind you, of course, that Limited Resources is brought to you every week by ChannelFireball.com. Make sure you check out all the great content and, of course, the great selection of cards that they have available there. Another thing related to that is that my videos, my draft videos, I was with 2 different sites previously. I am with one site now, and it's Channel Fireball. They are going to be appearing there in the near future. We're getting the last of it worked out, but I actually sent in my first video today. So, there's probably a little bit of setup to do on the Channel Fireball side, but those will start to be flowing. The schedule right now is I'm going to be doing 6 videos a month. So, some weeks I'll have 2 and some weeks we'll have 1. And that's kind of where we're going to start out. And so for those of you that have been asking about if I'm still doing videos and how that works, yes, and they're going to be at Channel Fireball. I'm very excited for that too. It'll be pretty cool to have everything kind of in one place there. Next week, Luis, are you ready? Talking about swimming pools. We're throwing you in the deep end. It is the Fate Reforged set review show next week. So start resting your vocal cords now, drinking a lot of water. And when we have you come in next week, we're going to be going over every single common and uncommon from Fate Reforged. And I couldn't be more excited to have gotten you in right before the set review. They're the shows that I think now at this point we can say that kind of the rest of the shows sort of revolve around those. They get way more downloads than the regular episodes. A lot of people come out of the woodwork to hear the set reviews, and they've kind of become their own animal. And I'm super stoked that you're going to be here, even if it is early in your Limited Resources career, where we get you early for Fate Reforged set review.
Yeah, and from what I've heard, we could probably knock it out in like 30, 40 minutes, right?
Yeah, we'll talk off air about that one. No, but it'll be fun. Lots of cool cards too. Fate Reforged looks pretty interesting from what I've seen. So that should be a fun one.
Yeah, I mean, going back to slightly game designery talk, there's a 5/5 flying haste dragon that shuffles back into your deck as a common. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that one next week. So lots of cool stuff. As usual, if you guys want to get a hold of us, the easiest, quickest way for both of us is Twitter. That's the way that you can get a quick question out or say hi. I know that Luis checks Twitter all the time. I know I do as well. My Twitter name is Marshall_LR, and Luis's is LSV. Just those 3 letters, and you can say hi. If you have something longer to say, you can send us an email. It's lr@lrcast.com. If you want to join the clan on Magic Online, it's easy to do. You do have to find me online now. They don't let you leave messages anymore. But if you do find me on there, you can just ask me for a clan invite and I'll get you one. The only rules to get in the clan are that you have to love Magic and you can't be a jerk. It's really simple. Very, very low bar. I'm sure you qualify. And just hit me up on there and I'll get you a clan invite. We are the biggest clan on Magic Online with the most packs won ever. And it's fun to be a part of. Of course, you can also check out the limited resources subreddit. That's where a lot of the clan chat takes place, along with other chatter about anything limited really and Magic and all that kind of stuff. You can find the link for that on lrcast.com. Luis, good first show, man. You did it.
We did.
You did it. And until next week, guys, well, we'll see you then.
So I've heard a thing or two about sign-offs, and apparently Brian used to do some pretty legendary ones, as well as John. I heard something about scripts and all that, so I'm going to do something a little bit different. I do love the idea because I like talking about things, and especially talking about things that I just get to come up with. Especially those things don't have to really relate to anything. I just get to talk about whatever I want. So
that you do.
The theme I had today was sportsmanship, and kind of the reason it came about is that I played against a fine individual, or maybe a not so fine individual online. This actually documented in my latest Cube video on ChannelFireball, who didn't like how the match went and said, essentially like, screw you, I'm timing you out, and decided to just leave.
Oh, lovely.
And make me wait the last, 20 minutes or whatever. And that prompted me to just talk about a slightly larger issue, which is, kind of sportsmanship within the game and at the end of the game, which is something that a lot of people have divided opinions on and or struggle with. So I think one of the most contentious issues is the handshake. What happens when, with the handshake? Because if you look at
yes.
Magic coverage, for example, almost every match ends with a handshake. Like
yes.
you see the hand, and actually it overwhelmingly ends with the loser offering the handshake. And kind of where I personally fall on that is, first of all, I think the most important thing is don't get offended when your opponent's trying to say something nice at the end. Like, I myself will tend to offer the hand if I'm losing, like, because I sit there and when you're the losing player, you're the one who knows when the game exactly ends. Like, both players might know a game is going to be over, but you're the one who decides, okay, this is where the game ends, unless you literally let them make you attack you for lethal, which is fine too. But either way, you're the person who has priority the last time, because you're the one who says, like, yep, that's lethal damage. So at that point, I'll extend a handshake and I'll say good game and I'll say good luck. A lot of people seem to get offended when their opponent does that when they won, especially when it wasn't a good game. They got mana screwed, they got unlucky, their opponent top decked, whatever. And I actually think that's pretty poor sportsmanship. I think, even though I myself will tend to offer a handshake when I've lost, because I think that's, generally I think that's the one that's going to cause the least friction. You want the match to end. You want it to let your opponent know that it was a good clean match, and then that was that. If your opponent wins the game and offers the handshake and says good game, the correct way to answer that is to accept the handshake and say good game. It's not to be like, oh, well, I got mana screwed, or, oh, you're the winner, you're not supposed to do that. That's not good sportsmanship. Yes, there's a somewhat of an etiquette to the loser tends to do this, but I think if your opponent has good intentions, you should just take them at that. You shouldn't get offended that they broke this like unspoken rule, because that's not really how it is. I think at the end of the game, I mean, Magic's a fun game, and it's way more fun when everyone's having a good time and when everyone acts like a good sport. Like, yeah, losing sucks. No one likes to lose. It's not fun to lose, but you shouldn't take it out on your opponent. When I mulligan to 4, or my opponent draws very luckily, because you can identify when your opponent draws lucky, trust me. and you lose, just take it at that, wish them good luck, shake their hand, and then go complain to your friends if you need to. It really, I don't think, does anyone any favors to act like a poor sport at the end of the game. So that's my little spiel on sportsmanship. And honestly, I think the world would be a better place if everyone had that attitude for things regarding not just Magic or other games. But there we have it.